So I'm very happy that this big data conference has been running for so many years. And especially this year, we can maintain this tradition. And although it's online, but I'm looking forward next year we will be able to do it in the CMSA physically and have welcome everybody. But still, I'm very excited for this year's conference because I can see all the speakers are talking about the most interesting problems in big data, including the hardest topics and so. So let me say once again, welcome all the speakers and all the audience, and I will turn to the chair of this the morning sessions, Sergiy.
Thank you. Okay, so let me introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Xiaohong Chen, professor of economics at Yale University. Just to give you a short bio, her first degree was actually in mathematics from Wuhan University, and she completed her doctorate at the University of California, San Diego. Professor Chen is an expert in econometric theory. She particularly focuses on semi-parametric and non-parametric methods. She received many awards for her work, including Richard Stone and Arnold Zellner prizes, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Xiaohong, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you for your kind invitation. It's a great honor to participate in this diverse talks. And I originally gave 2 titles for the talk, but I think I will focus mostly on the applied one first. Probably just have one slide mention the other one. The first talk is the applied one is actually is joined with 2 people at Harvard. I think it's good. Actually, if people can attend in person, you can just ask my co-authors, Kevin Chen and Enid Tamer there. They are both in Harvard Econ department. Okay, so this talk is, the first paper is about multi-layer neural network efficient estimation in non-parametric instrument variables. It's more like try to do Monte Carlo and real data comparison of different estimators to really see how neural network works in this setup. So this the setup is, the model looks simple, but not that simple. The model is so-called non-parametric instrument variables model, is this one. It's a leading case of so-called conditional moment restriction models in economics, including many asset pricing and Bellman equation, and demand and supply models. Here, the key thing is both Y1, which is you can call outcome variable, and Y2. Y2 here itself is a vector, could including something what we call endorsed variable. Think about if Y1 is log demand for gasoline, and Y2 probably will be what, log price for gasoline and some other variables. Where the key thing, what we call here Y2 could be endogenous. What do we mean by endogenous? Means this Y2 actually is not subset of X. X is so-called condition variable or covariates or instrument variables. This is not typical regression. If for typical non-parametric regression, Y2 will be just X. Here, Y2 doesn't need to be X. That's a key distinction, which happens a lot in economics application. And here's a policy of interest is this parameter looks very simple. It's average, weighted average derivative of the function with respect to some variables. For example, this is really, if you think about one argument of Y2 is a continuous treatment, then this average derivative will be really corresponding to average training effect parameters. Really think about, if you think about the increase gasoline price, right? Then you want to see how that impact on consumer welfare. That is a leading example of the average price elasticity, which will be this kind of parameters. Okay, that is what we're interested in, to do efficient estimation, to do optimal inference about. The key difficulty here is the unknown function, because we don't specify functional form of H0. Unknown function can depend on moderate high dimensional induced variables Y2, and also without known sparsity. In many realistic economic applications, you actually don't know priority whether or not they have sparsity. So in this setup, then it's natural thing says, oh, let's apply neural network. Here we regard neural network as a particular sieve to approximate this unknown function H. So we are focused on neural network efficient estimation and inference for beta. That's the setup. So now the question is, why we're interested in this? First, to apply neural net, partly because neural net itself is just simple composition of simple functions of this form, right? First, you take kind of linear combinations and take nonlinear transformations, and take linear combination of those and doing nonlinear transformations, and you get the output. So this just, each step is simple, but through these compositions, then you can be very flexible to can approximate anything. The key thing is this layer L. If you think about neural net approximation theory, you just have one hidden layer that already make it a so-called nonlinear approximation class, already very flexible, can be dense in a huge class of functions. In economics, we have been using one hidden layer neural net. But recently, the success story in other science, like including two speakers and here, and all focus on multi-layer or deep layer when L, this composition layer is very big, like hundreds and thousands. The question here is, we said in economics application where the data set typically is noisy, we don't have huge high quality data, whether or not this deep layer neural net is really needed, and whether or not a single hidden neural net is already flexible enough. That's the thing we are interested in. And also compared to other simpler approximation classes such as spline, whether or not neural net do have advantage. So this is what we're interested in to investigate, is whether or not we really need deep layer or over parameterized or all fitted neural net for estimate these kind of problems. Remember, because of the endogeneity Y2 is not X, this estimation for H of Y2 is not prediction problem. So we can't using the typical black box prediction to do estimation and inference for this type of problems. Then the other thing is whether or not multi-layer, because here, if you look at this different nonlinear transformation, the sigma here corresponding different activation function, and the earlier success is all using ReLU, like this kind of max T0, this kind of activation function. The question is whether or not this have anything special. In terms of approximation theory, there's nothing special about using this ReLU. So we just want to investigate in Monte Carlo to see whether or not they have any special ReLU activation versus others, such as sigmoid, which is popular in earlier application in economics. And then remember, even for single hidden layer, even when L equals to 1, single hidden layer, the neural net is already nonlinear sieve. Then whether or not nonlinear sieve performs better than say spline, which is linear sieve in some realistic economics setting. So that's the other thing we want to investigate. Then also in terms of efficient estimation inference on this average treatment effect, average derivative parameters, they have two big classes of efficient estimators. they are asymptotically first order, they are equivalent. Again, we want to see in final sample which performs better. One is so-called efficient influence function or efficient score based approach. The other is using optimal criterion based approach. We want to see which performs better in practice. The first order asymptotically equivalent. Okay, before we show you the finding, I first remind you, because we are focused on efficient estimation for this beta parameter, I have to first show you what is efficiency bound. Then we'll give you the estimators. Okay, so first is what is the efficient 7-parameter efficient estimation here? I realize this is a diverse audience. Basically, you can think about efficient estimation or efficient variance here is just given this model information, what's the best possible estimator means the one gives you the smallest asymptotic variance. That roughly is best estimator or so-called efficient estimator. Okay, for that is really characterized by so-called efficient influence function or efficiency bound. So for this class model, this in terms of moment restriction, just we have this one condition moment restriction, right? This one used to identify this unknown function H, think about demand function or supply function, or as surprising Bellman equation. So then you have this. What we're really interested in is this average derivative parameter or the average tuning effect parameter, which is you can think about this as unconditional moment. So for this class model, if this is all the information you have, then you observe data on Y1, Y2, X. You don't know their joint distribution. All you know is they satisfy these two restrictions. So what's the best possible way to estimate beta 0? So we said the best variance is given by this variance of this so-called efficient influence function. So this efficient influence function is characterized by two parts. The first part is what we so-called orthogonalized residuals, which is just take this, regress this on this condition moment part. This condition moment, this will give you, you can think about residual. Then this so-called orthogonalized residual, this is really regress this on that, regress unconditional moment on conditional moment, and take this, this you can think about this will be the least square regression. So this will be orthogonalized residual. So you take this piece, but then you have to adjust the fact you actually don't know the functional form of H. So you have to estimate it from data. So this is a so-called adjustment piece. So this piece is what in mathematics also called race representative. The problem here is this race representative itself is unknown. This V star, which comes from itself, comes from solving or optimization, is actually infinite dimensional optimization problem. By solving this, I just want to flash out, just show you it's very complex, means you actually you don't know yourself. Okay, so basically to get the best efficient estimator for beta means whatever estimator you want to asymptotically give you this variance. If you knew this efficient influence function, just doing plug-in, you will get the efficient estimator, right? That's indeed the first approach to get efficient estimation is try to figure out this efficient influence function, which can apply from these earlier results. You can using this will be the first efficient estimator. Just taking ES means subscript VM means efficient score or efficient influence, which are all in the literature now also called Newman and Sogren moments. And this is the first estimator. The expression looks simple, but barrier unit have many unknowns. First is we don't know unknown function H. We need to estimate it. And then we don't know this orthogonalized residual part. We need to estimate it. And then we don't know this adjustment piece. The fact you don't know H, you estimated this adjustment piece. I said this adjustment piece itself involves this drift center option 1, which is itself is solving an optimization problem in interdimensional. And this sigma here is option weighting, the condition variance. Okay, so that's the first way to get efficient estimator, just using the condition moment restriction, come up with the estimate H, then plug into estimate its derivative, then also estimate this square orthogonalized residual bits, and also then also need to estimate this optimal, this race center. So then plug into this efficient inference function. This is the first procedure, which is so-called orthogonal moment procedure. Okay, then the second estimator, second big class estimator, comes from doing the optimal minimum distance, which is also proposed in that paper, but never actually implemented. So you said it looks like optimal minimum distance, but how come this looks like just very simple? Yeah, the optimal minimum distance really corresponding how to estimate this unknown function H, which we'll show you later on. Once we have that, then you also have the estimation of this, then you just plug into here. This itself now looks simpler than this, right? The efficient one need to doing this extra adjustment piece. This doesn't need to. But then you can show asymptotically this is first order equivalent to the one using this efficient inference function. Okay, so these are two class estimators we are going to compare. In this paper, what we are going to do is this unknown function H itself. In both cases, we were either using neural network or using spline minimum distance to estimate. Then afterwards, we will estimate this gamma. With gamma, you can see in both procedures, we need to estimate H and gamma. Both procedures we were doing the same way to estimate, because gamma, once when you know H, you can compute derivatives, then you can estimate this easily. You can also estimate this weighting. Once when you know H, you can estimate this condition variance easily using whatever machine learning or whatever non-parametric procedure. So then the only difference between these two procedures is this efficient score or orthogonal moment need to estimate this optimal the race center, which is itself solving another optimization problem. The optimal minimum distance base doesn't need to do that, just direct. So that makes it simpler. But you can see to get optimal procedure, we actually involve the optimal condition variance. So this part corresponds to optimal weighting. Alternatively, if you don't care about to get the efficient estimator, means if you don't care about get the estimator which has the smallest variance, you can just doing what? Simply you can just doing identity weighting. That making things much simpler. So this corresponding to identity weighting, we will also have the two class of estimators. One is also so-called inefficient minimum distance. Just you have direct doing this plugin, which is very simple. You are first doing say neural net to estimate the unknown function H, just plug in here. So this will be IE means inefficient inference function. The variance here is larger than the variance in the optimal the inference function. Here, once when you're doing asymptotic expansion, you also have this adjustment piece. This also is a race representative, also solve a optimization problem. But this optimization problem is easier because you don't involve the optimal weighting in it. So based on this inefficient orthogonal moment, you can also do a plug-in to get a inefficient estimator. So now quickly we have four classes of estimator, four estimators. Two asymptotic inefficient but they are all equivalent, and two asymptotically efficient, they are also first order equivalent. But then I mentioned 4 estimators using here. Now, how come I give you 6? Partly because in the literature right now, also people try to do, in terms of asymptotic theory proof, is easier to do so-called split sample or cross-fit. Basically, just think about you have big sample, you split into 2, using one sample to estimate the unknown function h, then using the other sample to estimate this other nuisance part and to plug in to estimate these unknown parameters. So that we will also compare this called split sample, which is corresponding to this inefficient score one. We will have a split sample one, means using one sample to estimate h, using other sample to estimate beta. The same thing corresponding to optimal weighting. Okay, so partly this just theoretically in terms of proof is easier, but in final sample how perform we want to compare. Partly if you think about your split sample, that means you have smaller sample size to estimate unknown function. That might increase the variance. But when you're doing split sample, you reduce the dependence. So then you probably have better bias property. So that's all the trade-off. Okay, now in the rest of the talk, I'm going to compare these different performance. The first thing is throughout the talk, the rest of the talk, I will use the unknown function h. We were either using neural net sieve minimum distance estimator or using spline sieve minimum distance estimator for to compute the to estimate unknown function h0, which comes from this condition moment restriction. So this is the most difficult one to estimate. After that, based on that, because all these other unknown nuisance functions, like gamma hat, which is for the orthogonal residual adjustment, and the efficient race representative and the inefficient race representative, they are all the functions of this unknown function h. You need to plug in that. So the main focus is neural net to estimate this h hat. Okay, so then what is the sieve minimum distance estimation for h0 and using h hat? Is h0 is solving this what we call non-permitting instrumental variable regression models, use this condition moment restriction. And the first is we just approximate this unknown function h by using whatever basis. Here we will either using neural net or using spline. Then we will take this, think about generalized residual, we will project on this conditioning variable, which is itself then using some basis expansion. We will call it IV sieves, which is this another basis. Then this projection is easy. Then if we're using linear sieve to as transformation of x, this projection we're just doing least square projection. So after that, so then basically then you're choosing the sieve, say neural net sieve coefficient or spline sieve coefficient, which you use to approximate h. Just pick up those coefficients to minimize this quadratic distance from 0. Remember, the true function have to satisfy this condition moment restriction. So it's really just look at the quadratic distance of that from 0. So this is so-called sieve minimum distance, because the unknown function h is using either neural net sieve or spline sieve to approximate. So the weighting here is just in terms of the for efficiency purpose. For inefficient one, we were using identity weighting. For efficient one, we were using this optimal condition variance to do weighting. Unfortunately, this itself needs to be estimated. Okay, so this now later on the notation, all SMD means optimal weighted sieve minimum distance. Okay, now I will show you, I will just have one quick slide to mention why in theory neural net might be better when Y2 is high dimension. Here, neural net in terms of approximation theory, the setup here is we assume the true unknown function h0 here belong to some function space, infinite dimensional function space. We don't know, we have no knowledge about it, except maybe it's kind of smooth functions. So then here we were using different class of bases to do approximation to it. The one big class is in traditional using linear sieves such as a spline, orthogonal series, or polynomials, Hermann polynomials, or wavelengths to approximate. Usually, if the typically assumes the unknown function belong to some holder smooth class or solver of smooth class. For there, the approximation property is really corresponding to the sieve number of terms raised to the power minus smoothness divided by dimension of Y2. Roughly, this linear sieve will suffer so-called cursive dimensionality, means given the fixed smoothness, usually you can sigma smoothness can be measured by number of derivatives roughly in economics. So then you can see if given the smoothness, fixed smoothness, then the approximation error rate will really suffer if the dimension of Y2 just means if you have Y2 is, if the dimension of Y2 is large, then this approximation error rate is very bad. In the extreme, if the dimension of Y2 goes infinity, then actually you, in terms of approximation error rate, just big O1, right, means terrible. The idea is as sample size goes to infinity, you need this shrink to zero fast. Okay, so that's why this all the linear sieves suffer so-called cursive dimensionality. That's why people get excited with nonlinear sieve, even for single hidden layer neural net already have much better different approximation error property. I just give you this single hidden layer for so-called for the smooth class belong to so-called barren class. Then even for single hidden layer neural net, the earlier results, I have some old paper with my PhD advisor Howard White, which already show the approximation error rate in L2 norm is faster than square root of number of neurons, which is much better in theory than the linear sieve. Of course, those for single hidden layer. Now, recent success story is about multi-layer, right? Which is single hidden layer just means L equals to, so now multi-layer corresponding L greater than 2, greater than equal to 2. So then you can see just have a linear combinations and doing nonlinear transformations that do a linear combination. If you're just doing that once, that is so-called single hidden layer or sometimes called 2-layer. Then if you keep on doing it, you get to multi-layer. Now, of course, you have more flexibility because L is number of hidden layers. Now you can let it to also grow with sample size. Then now you have the max dimension of the width, which can also grow with sample size. Originally, when you're doing single hidden layer, L is fixed, then you really just need to letting the width go to infinity with sample size. Or so for this flexibility, the key thing is control the growth of the norm. Of course, again, the choice of norm matters a lot, either using L1 norms, this or that. Okay, it's still very active research area. Now have all kinds of approximation error property, depends on where you put the class belong to and what kind of complexity measure you use. Basically, you can have all kinds of approximation error rate. So I just give you some reference. Okay, now back to our setup. Here, since I'm about to run out of time, so I will, in the paper, we have many more Monte Carlos and more estimators. Here, I will just show you the Monte Carlo design 2 and quickly design 3 and other Monte Carlo design. Also just show you a subset of estimators. The first comparison is, when we started this project several years ago, in economics, they have this misunderstanding that ReLU is special. Any other activation function will not work. We have to do ReLU. But according to approximation theory, what matters is a nonlinear activation function. What kind of nonlinear activation function shouldn't matter that much? ReLU is a particular one. So that is what we want to compare. The first one is we initially just did the optimal weighted minimum distance estimation for H, then doing that based plug into estimate beta. We really want to compare ReLU versus the sigmoid, two different class of activation functions, then different layer to see whether or not things matters a lot. And also then they also have the theoretical approximation property shows multi-layer neural net can adapt to the true unknown structure. In this Monte Carlo design, the true unknown function H0 is actually satisfies so-called partially additive structure, because the true function, the beta 0 is this partial derivative here is actually just a constant in front of this R1, which is just identical equal 1. This in Monte Carlo design, we know the truth. So, but of course, in the implementation, we don't assume we don't know the truth. We just need to approximate this unknown function H of Y2. Y2 here, we're including R1, R2, X2, X tilde. Why? Because R1, R2 are two endogenous variables, means they are correlated with error term U, and X2 are exogenous, means they're uncorrelated with error term U, and then we're also throwing other exogenous variables X tilde, which is uncorrelated with U, but they can be arbitrarily correlated among themselves. Okay, so that's a setup, and it could be cook up very arbitrary complex nonlinearity. Okay, so then because say the highest number of the covariance in term, including in Y2 will be 13 dimensions, because we can have X10, X tilde can up to 10 dimensions. So you have 3 other variables. The Monte Carlo here will just show you corresponding to when sample size is 5,000. So these are the Monte Carlo is 100 Monte Carlo run average. Here I just show you Monte Carlo mean. Remember, true mean is 1, and also the Monte Carlo. I just did we did just 1 standard deviation. In practice, when you're doing for t-stats inference is roughly 2 standard deviation. Here just show you 1. Okay. What's the comparison? This is a lot. Actually, we run many more. Say, just show you a few, because we actually have many. Initially, we have many different layers, up to 20 layers, 10 layers, and we also have different activation functions. Here, just show you 1 hidden layer or 3 hidden layer, because the other doesn't matter much. This are corresponding to number of hidden layers, and then the other things very different ways. So here main things compare the ReLU versus sigmoid, 2 different nonlinear activation functions. So you said if you look at the color, you can see it actually doesn't matter. First, look at this. NP means, since treat this as fully non-parametric, just using neural net to do approximation. Don't exploit this true structure. This corresponding to this NP. This PL means partial linear, means we enforce a structure that this R1 enter linearly, then the rest we just assume they enter non-linearly, non-parametrically. We don't enforcing the partially additive structure. Then this other PA means we actually enforce the true correct structure partially additive. Now you see what comparison. First, this doing fully non-parametric. This actually, you see the first column shows this different color, blue, red. Red corresponding using ReLU activation function. Different color is corresponding either using identity weighting or using optimal weighting. Looks like started optimal weighting, the efficient one, and should have a smaller variance, but actually looks like similar, but sometimes just have smaller bias instead. Variance looks like similar. Probably the heteroscedasticity is not that severe in this Monte Carlo design. We don't know. And then this sigmoid, you can see the first thing from the first column is what kind of nonlinear activation function doesn't matter much. In some sense, actually, sigmoid sometimes actually is slightly better than ReLU, because ReLU sometimes will run into numerical issue in terms of computing derivatives, so you will end up with bigger bias and bigger variance. But roughly they are all similar, and optimal weighted one had slightly smaller variance and a smaller bias, slightly better than the inefficient one. But to our surprise, what's more interesting, compare this versus you enforcing the structure. This you enforcing the partial linear structure. Actually, without enforcing it, doing fully non-parametric actually performs better than you actually sometimes enforce it. But then this actually enforcing even more, enforcing the partially additive structure, really enforcing correct structure. Then look at this one. This corresponding to ReLU. You said this actually looks much worse. What happened? This is because this partially additive. The funny thing is the first H1, H2, these two unknown functions, their argument is just a scalar variable. Here, even for scalar variable, we're also using ReLU neural net to approximate. In theory, neural net can approximate anything, right? So which is fine as well. But we know in terms of common sense, probably for scalar, unknown function of scalar random variable, you don't need to using ReLU because nonlinear computation is harder. This definitely shows up here in this Monte Carlo. You can see using neural net to approximate all those actually, if you're using, especially using ReLU, actually make it much worse. Because if you're using the sigmoid, actually performs still very well. Just ReLU makes it very worse. Then you said, what's this column? This column is still, this one, X tilde can be high dimension, goes to 10 dimension. So this one, this unknown function, we're still using neural net, but this other two, we're using spline, linear C. You can see this is really performs the best. But still, in terms of, if you don't know any structure, just being fully non-parametric, using neural net actually perform best. So this, in some sense, is good news, confirms that neural net do adapt to the unknown structure, which is good. But then also says actually what kind of nonlinear activation function doesn't matter, at least in this Monte Carlo design, how many layers doesn't matter. Okay. Now, of course, we really want to compare to the other method doing the orthogonal moment, the efficient inference function, which is now very popular in economics, because so-called orthogonal moment, or have another nice name called double robust. So we want to compare to that to see whether or not that performs better. And also we want to, initially we want to show neural net-based spline. So then we said, no, let's compare to spline. So that's how we compare to here. Now, to our surprise, spline actually always perform very well. Even though in theory, neural net should, when dimensions high, neural net should do better than spline. But spline actually perform as well as neural net. Neural net, we actually did a lot of tuning. Spline, we actually didn't do any tuning. And then the other is the optimal weighted one, is I showed you earlier. Then the other is ES means efficient inference. Then ESX means doing spirit sample, which is what people advertise now, doing spirit samples and can have better bias property. Now compare the efficient one, efficient inference one, corresponding orthogonal moment versus doing optimal criterion base. Actually, looks like optimal criterion base looks like could be more stable than doing the efficient inference function one. So we want to figure out what's going on exactly. Turns out in the efficient inference one, the performance I mentioned earlier, you have to estimate this astral optimal race representative, which also involves this optimal weighting sigma inverse in it. Turns out the performance is very sensitive to how you estimate that for the efficient the efficient score doing plugin. This is efficient. This is the efficient score, because the efficient score you need to estimate this compared to the optimal weighted one. To estimate this involve estimation of the optimal, the inverse of condition variance. Think about it already for high dimensional X. You estimate condition variance already difficult, then you need to estimate its inverse of that. Because if this thing, then you estimate this optimal reserve center, you did give you the expression is very complex. You plug in to estimate this. Then you plug into here to do the adjustment. So it turns out, if you don't estimate this inverse of the condition variance, high dimensional condition variance, which is non-parametric, if you don't estimate this well, then the ends performance is very sensitive to it. Look at here. So all the difference is just show different way to estimate this inverse variance, because the condition variance has to be positive definite. Here we're using nearest neighbor. So then you can see how many k nearest neighbor. This k is either 1,000, 100, or 50 or 5. You can see matters a lot. But again, this actually is compilation is doing neural net estimation of edge, plug in to estimate this versus spline. Because if you look at the spline one, spline actually here, bottom, some parts are spline. Spline actually is not sensitive. Yes, these are spline. Spline are not sensitive, but the neural net one can be very sensitive. Okay, so then, of course, those are really just, in some sense, is checking the performance of point estimates, because we show you the Monte Carlo mean Monte Carlo standard deviation. Now, in practice, we don't know the true design, so we have to estimate the variance to do the inference, right? To construct confidence interval. So now to see which will give you better confidence interval, more accurate inference. So again, here I know it's very heavy. The picture, because I have a lot of estimator. We want to compare different neural nets and splines and different using efficient inference one versus inefficient one versus doing optimal weighted one. The optimal minimum distance one. Again, the bottom line, the message is the estimated standard errors for spline based optimal weighted one is most reliable, and is the one for the efficient score or inefficient score is the estimate variance is underestimate the variability, while the one based on the optimal, the minimum distance is more accurate. Okay, that's a bottom line message. Then, of course, we said, yeah, maybe the original design is too simple. Let's make it the average derivative part more complex, make itself to be nonlinear. So because it's average derivative with R1, right? So now we make it become nonlinear. It's R1 squared divided 2 plus R2 times some other highly complex nonlinear functions. Then we thought maybe now the neural net have advantage over spline. Okay, here, now just look at the 5,000 sample size larger one. You can see again, even though the optimal weighted, the neural net also performs well, but they, again, is not as stable as the spline one. So then we think that probably because here we focus on average training effect parameter. If we just, which is corresponding here, average partial derivative. If we just look at the estimate of the partial derivative itself as a function, then maybe neural net will do better, which is indeed the case, because here we are making the average derivative, partial derivative itself is highly nonlinear. So for the is corresponding to these two pieces, F1 is just true, one is linear. So this blue dot corresponding using the sigmoid neural net estimate. This red dot corresponding spline, you can see spline have we just did cubic spline have this outlier here. Then the same, but of course we cook up the design for two F2 in such a way we on purpose give neural net advantage. Why? Because this F2 here has a tail which like sigmoid tail. So this blue dot neural net is using the sigmoid activation function, which does give the neural net advantage compared to spline. But the spline is again just cubic spline. But the spline actually doesn't. It's again just in the tail starting to mess up. But remember, once when you're doing average the trimming effect parameter, then still perform well. Okay, that is one design. Then we said we will do a more realistic design. Let's take the one from the real data application, which is gasoline demand, which I will show you the real data. So this Monte Carlo is we simulate the data from the real data, the gasoline demand. So here, for gasoline demand, people care about the average price elasticity, which is precisely parameter we're estimating here. So now in Monte Carlo design, we will make the sample size much bigger. Actually, in real data applications, the sample size is even much smaller than 5,000. So that's the other message. To make neural net perform well, you really need to have a much bigger sample size. I didn't show you when sample size small, neural net perform worse. Okay, so now the bottom line is for large enough sample size, everything works well. So spline still do well, and then this is spline optimum weighted. This is neural net optimum weighted. Where did the this identity one, this corresponding to optimum weighted one. They all look similar. Then this corresponding identity weighted using the orthogonal moment doing plugin, or you can call double robust plugin. This is doing split sample. Again, split sample here, when sample size is really huge, split sample will perform as well. But even 5,000 in economics application, 5,000 is not small, then actually split sample can actually make the variance slightly bigger. Then the main sensitive part is efficient inference function one, right? Efficient inference function I just showed you in the earlier Monte Carlo design also performance very sensitive to how you estimate the condition variance, right? So here now you can see in this Monte Carlo design, the same pattern shows up. Depends on the how you estimate condition variance. In this Monte Carlo design, found nearest neighbor actually perform much better than if you're doing larger nearest neighbor. So this is totally different from this other Monte Carlo design, which is when you're using smaller found nearest neighbor is more biased is here, where found nearest neighbor is more biased compared to 100. So, but bottom line, the bottom line, the message is the same. The efficient inference function, even though it is orthogonal moment, double robust moment, have all those nice theoretical property, but to estimate all those actual nuisance function, especially in high dimension, is very sensitive because estimate because here you need to estimate inverse of condition variance well. So that means, I mean, you have no sense how to estimate inverse of condition variance, right? Condition variance itself is condition on high dimensions already very difficult to estimate. You need to estimate inverse very well. It's really completely in dark. So you can see in this Monte Carlo, you see doesn't perform well. It means no, perform fine is very sensitive. And if itself originally doesn't perform well, if you're doing sample splitting, it doesn't perform well. Okay, that's the main takeaway. In some sense, I guess the bottom message here probably is not that encouraging to people so excited with neural net. Typically for economics application, if the real data, if the sample size is not very big and the data is noisy, sometimes simpler method is better than fancier method. Because fancy methods, you have many more nuisance functions to estimate whatever black box, you will always actually give you some noise, some interactions. Anyway, based on all those convincing Monte Carlo, we will just report in the real data application. We will report the single minimum distance one, which because it's more stable than the efficient inference one, and also inefficient inference, the orthogonal moment is better than efficient one. So that's what we report in the real data application. We have this optimal weighted using spline. We're using neuron sigmoid and ReLU different layer, and this inefficient one, this optimal weighted one, this inefficient orthogonal moment, the plugin, then this corresponding spline. So because spline we know is always stable. So then this compared to the earlier, because this data set come from Branda et al. Paper. So their papers, they have this treated as parametric doing ordinary square. So we compare to theirs. And then they also worry about endogeneity. They report two-stage square. There is parametric one. So here we did non-parametric. So you can see the results are closer to their non-parametric, to their two-stage square, the endogeneity one. So in this application, we have 7 covariates. The log gasoline price, the log demand, the log gasoline price is endogenous. Whereas care about the price elasticity. Here is the IO demand, like a multi-product demand. Here just have two product, differential product. We have non-organic strawberry versus organic strawberry. This is the marketing data from Giovanni paper, which is now just published in QE from his job market paper. This is from the Nielsen's scanner data set. Okay, we have to have this, and this claim you have nothing to do with their company. Okay, the reporting results. So we take the subset from there. So then we have this. Here we have 2 endogenous variables. We have the both organic strawberry demand and inorganic strawberry demand. They are all endogenous, and actually they have some other endogenous variables. So here we have income, then have some, then we also have some outside goods, which is nitrous demand, which is a test for organic proxy. So we actually have 3 endogenous variables. Then we have some other. So this typical IO application. I don't have time to talk about it anymore. But so they have all these instruments. Basically, this is a high dimension. That's why I think it's good to apply the neural net here, because it's much higher dimension. I think I will run out of time. So basically, again, the Bayesian message is the optimal weighted one is more stable. So that's why we will recommend that. And then we recommend using, if you want to do orthogonal moment, we recommend you using inefficient one instead of the optimal one. So that is basically the message for first paper. The second paper is more generally, the first paper is a special case in some sense of this unconditional moment and conditional moment. So in more general, you can think about conditional moment could be so-called quantile conditional moment restriction. Unconditional moment could be some other average derivative quantile demand. You can think about inverse default conditional value risk, and more general conditional moment. You can have the of policy evaluation in reinforcement learning will map into this framework. So that paper is for time series. That paper, the inference is doing the based on the optimal minimum distance like this paper, but it is focused on doing cause-effect ratio based inference. But actually that paper is for time series, the implementation is even much harder. I will stop here. I think
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Xiaohong. We have one question from the audience, Parindash Khatri. Can you please speak? We'll try to let you speak. Can you please unmute yourself? While Parinda is working on it, a quick question from me. You and many other authors are admitting that hyperparameters really matter in the case of neural networks.
Yes.
It looks like a lot of people recognize it, but nobody takes it as a separate standalone issue to investigate, because it sounds very unscientific. What do you think about it? Is there any promise in understanding better how hyperparameters really matter here?
No, that's I totally agree with you. My course and I will totally agree with you. The fact is, even though we just show you this subset of Monte Carlo, we actually tried that for several years. The Monte Carlo here, we show you Monte Carlo for neural net. We tried very hard in terms of tuning. We only just show you the good results, because many people are now also excited with neural net. We don't want to show you bad results, right? Much more sensitive results. So we really tried very hard to show you the set of results. Neural net perform well here. But that's a problem, right? Because for spline, I didn't mention for spline, for this type of problem, I have other paper with other co-authors, because spline's linear sieve will have much scientific, theoretical, justified data-driven way of choosing tuning parameter. Also works very well in practice. I originally want to present that paper, but I guess organizers here, everybody excited with neural net. So I will, okay, just show the neural net. The problem is neural net for this kind of problems, when you have endogeneity, which is what economists care about, right? If you think about causal inference, counterfactual, all want to care about have endogeneity, think about the trade, elasticity, all those things. We all have the endogenous variable in it. And where you couldn't take black box, the prediction criterion to choosing neural net tuning parameters. And so far there are no theoretical justification. The how to do it. And people theoretically say, oh, let's do orthogonal moment, doing split samples, that works well. You can see for everything will work in terms of first order asymptotic theory. But in practice, it's all these tuning parameters, how you tune it. There's no guidance, yeah. And the Monte Carlo here, we actually show you the sample size much bigger than the application.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's an open question. Yeah, for students and for researchers, yeah, everybody will welcome to work on this.
Yeah, and it has been open for many years, and nobody attempts to close it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And okay,
yeah, everybody just sending advantage, but don't avoid the hard question. Tuning parameter. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if Parinda is ready to answer her question. No, okay. So no questions from the audience, and we ran out for this section. So next is Jessica. Thank you, Xiaohong.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's always a little funny doing the applause just of the people at the top, but really fantastic talk.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
All right, up next is Jessica Jeffers, who is an assistant professor and David G. Booth faculty fellow at the Chicago Booth School of Business for just a couple more days, after which she will be joining HEC Paris as an associate professor of finance. She's a founding member of the Impact Finance Research Consortium, with research on both impact investing and labor and finance. She holds a bachelor's in economics and mathematics from Yale University and a PhD in finance from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where she received the AQR Top Finance Graduate Award and the Kaufman Dissertation Fellowship. She said I didn't have to, talk about other awards, but you should know she's extremely distinguished. Has a whole bunch of awards and honors, including, the Catalytic Capital Consortium Grant, the George Stigler Center Grant, the Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz Fellowship, and the Investment for Impact Research Prize. And her work is, overall fascinating and sort of really cool for how it blends cutting edge, state-of-the-art data to really help us understand sort of modern corporate finance and in particular impact. Please let's welcome Jessica Jeffers.
thanks, thanks, Scott, for that introduction. So I think I have probably the most applied, or at least reduced form paper on the program today. So it's going to be quite a change of pace, but this is much more about how economists can use big data in honestly fairly simple ways to answer pretty long-standing economic questions. So I'm going to essentially give you an example of that today. I'll try to pause maybe once or twice during the talk to answer questions that may have cropped up, as I'm presenting, because I don't want any lingering questions. And otherwise, I'll leave a little bit of time at the end to answer more questions. Okay, so in this case, this is joint work with Jeff Gortmaker, who's a PhD student at Harvard, and Michael Lee, who's at the New York Fed. So standard Fed disclaimer applies that this does not represent necessarily the opinions of the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so our long-standing economic question that we're going to be targeting here is, how do employees respond to changes in their firm's health? There's been work for a long time on this. Workers can look to improve their outside options as maybe the fit deteriorates. They can search on the job, seek referrals, tap into or expand their networks. And this kind of activity has potentially really important implications for both workers themselves and for the firms that they work at, including implications for the firm's organizational capital, for the firm's human capital. The issue is that it's usually very difficult for us to measure this kind of early behavioral change on a large scale. And so what this paper is going to do is it's going to use changes in networking activity on LinkedIn following negative news for the firm. And in particular, we're going to focus mainly on negative news about the firm's credit rating. And I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. So why do we look at networking? Well, it's an important way for workers to improve their outside options. And in particular, when it's done on digital platforms like on LinkedIn, we can observe this in quote unquote real time at a high level of frequency with a wide range of magnitudes. So this is going to help us to detect changes in behavior pretty early on. The reason we're going to look at changes in firms' credit ratings or news about firms' credit ratings is that there's a longstanding literature in finance suggesting that workers should be sensitive to firms getting closer to bankruptcy. So that's where we're going to start. But something that we can ask, and to be honest, I think we're just going to scratch the surface of this in this paper, is do different types of news have different effects on network formation? You can think about doing potentially a lot more work on that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to really try to exploit the cross-section of workers and the cross-section of events to understand who's forming networks, who's connecting, and why are they doing that. So just to give you a little bit of a teaser, is it actually the case that this is all about getting closer to bankruptcy, and workers don't like to for their firm to go bankrupt, or is this something else? So we're going to look at how much proximity to bankruptcy matters. What about events that don't have anything to do with the financial condition of the firm? Meaning, if the firm is financed with debt, is it just about any negative news about the firm? How much does the networking activity that we measure actually predict leaving, and with how much of a lag does it predict leaving? And then last but not least, are these outcomes good or bad for workers, for firms? We're just going to try to get a sense of that as well. So let me introduce the LinkedIn data that we use. And when I finish describing the data, I will pause to take some questions before I get into the results, but let me first, tell you what we're using. So we get data directly from LinkedIn. We're not scraping the data. We actually got their permission to use this, but we don't have any individual names. So we're not identifying any individuals. That said, we have encrypted identifiers that we can track across different types of data. So two main types of data that we're going to exploit here. The first is connection activity. So we've got time-stamped connection pairs, and these are directed connections. So we know who initiates a connection, who receives a connection. We're going to be focusing on connections initiated by employees at a weekly frequency. And then the other type of information that we use is employment histories. So for those of you who are familiar with LinkedIn, and if not, I'll show you an example on the next slide. You know that you sort of upload a profile with your employment history, and that gives us information on employer names, start and end dates, standardized information on your occupation type, seniority, and so on. So in case you don't have LinkedIn profile, or it's been a while since you've looked at it, this is a bit of a refresher of what information might be on there. I've highlighted a couple of things, like, you have a network, professional network on there. You have your employer, job titles, dates that you were at different institutions. And then really critical for us is that there is this network aspect of the platform. So where each individual has different connections that they've made or that they've received. And as I said, we're going to be focused in this paper on connections that were made, that were initiated outwards with the timestamp for those connections. Now we take that information from LinkedIn. We are going to collapse it at into a firm by week panel. And then we're going to combine that with different types of events for firms. And in particular, as I mentioned, we look at credit events. So if a firm is financed, if a firm has any debt, right? If a firm is financed with any debt, then it receives a credit rating from rating agencies like Moody's or S&P. And these rating agencies will then disclose, how good they think the firm's financial health is. And one thing that they can do is they can issue a negative credit watch. And this is essentially, to give you an example from Moody's, this is essentially saying, well, we think we might be downgrading your credit rating pretty soon. We haven't decided to do it yet, but essentially this is a negative signal about where the firm's financial health is. So we're going to take that information, and we're going to be looking at, in the end, something like 650 different events across the various firms that we're looking at, and trying to see how networking activity changes in response to these events. So before I take questions, I'll just give you a quick overview of some summary stats. So for the firms in our sample, we've got pretty good representation on LinkedIn. Okay, we're not just talking about like 2 employees. The median firm in our sample has about 850 employees on LinkedIn. As you might imagine, this is highly skewed, so the average is much higher. The initiated connection rate, this is at the firm level. How many new connections are being initiated on average by the firm's employees. This is an annualized measure just to make things consistent across our analyses in the paper. So on average, a firm's employee creates about 20 new connections in a given year. And then we're also going to use the data to measure if people are leaving. So in our sample, about 13 to 15% of a firm's employees leave in any given calendar year. Right. So let me pause here and just see if there are any questions. I don't see anything that's come up in the Q&A. I'll just hold for a second if there are any questions on the data before I move on to how we're using it and what our results are. So like I said, we combine this with different events. Down watches are these negative credit watch signals from the rating agencies. This bottom row is the one that you should be focusing on. This is just, we isolate in our preferred specifications, we're going to isolate events that weren't preceded by another event. So we make sure that we're really focused on the event itself. I'm mostly going to present results on negative credit watches, but we also look at other types of events as well. So the way we're going to approach this is a very reduced form approach. We're going to essentially conduct a bunch of event studies. All right, so starting from 12 weeks before a given event, we're going to look at the abnormal connection activity. And we're going to look at that from 12 weeks before the event to 12 weeks after the event. Everything I'm going to show you today is just going to be graphs of these combined event studies. We include a lot of different fixed effects to try to non-parametrically account for different characteristics of the firms, of the industry. So really what we're trying to do here is focus on what is abnormal if you take out anything that can be explained by the firm, anything that can be explained by industry trends, really what's caused by the shock itself. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to be showing you graphs. So I'm going to be following some best practices from the literature and reporting cumulative coefficients of that abnormal networking activity. So starting from 12 weeks cumulative until 12 weeks after. So I'll show you what this looks like. It'll make more sense. So again, here on the y-axis, we've got that cumulative abnormal networking activity. So the essentially new connections formed that we can't explain otherwise. And we start 12 weeks before a negative credit signal. 0 is when, the week that this negative credit signal is issued, and then we go to 12 weeks after. So what can you see here? There's a little bit of a pre-trend, right? There's a little bit, it's not statistically different from 0, but you could say like, maybe there's some people who know what's coming. It definitely pops up after this news is released. So what this shows us is that in real time, essentially, employees are responding to this negative news about firms' financial health. And it really, the bulk of this happens after the event. Now, something that we were interested in, because we come from finance, we were interested in knowing whether this is actually related to how close the firm is to bankruptcy. That's the current sort of state of the literature, is that this must be because employees are seeing the writing on the wall for firms that are about to go bankrupt and they want to leave. So we take our sample of firms and we split it into 2 sets. The red set is firms that are their debt is below investment grade. What that means is they're relatively closer to bankruptcy. So, okay, a negative credit signal for employees at these firms, that's not good. Okay, there may be layoffs in the future or wage renegotiations or something, but the firms in black, those are firms that are pretty far from bankruptcy. And so, we would have thought that maybe if this is all about bankruptcy, maybe employees wouldn't care so much. Well, it turns out that if you look at their networking activity, that increases too. So it's not just limited to firms that are close to bankruptcy. And in the paper, we go into detail on why we think this is. We actually have a little model to explain this. I think this is less in this audience's interest, so I'm going to skip that for this talk, but happy to answer questions. The other thing that we might be interested in is who's connecting and what happens to these workers who are connecting. So in particular, we wanted to relate this to whether workers are leaving or not. Is this related to them jumping ship? With the data that we have from LinkedIn, we're able to separate out, within a firm, separate out 3 categories of employees. So in yellow, we've got employees who leave the firm in that year. In red, we've got employees who stay at the firm in this year, but the following year, they leave at some point. And then in black, you've got employees who stick around for 2 years at least. And then, you know, we don't follow them after 2 years. We say, okay, they're around for at least 2 more years. So what's interesting here is, again, we're still looking at abnormal networking activity, right? So but in each different group, it's really the individuals who are leaving who are connecting the most, but even the ones who stay for at least 2 years change their networking activity, right? So there's a monotonic relationship with how soon you're leaving. The sooner you're planning to leave, the more abnormal connections you create. But even if you're not immediately planning on leaving, there's still some activity there. And what really interested us was this idea that there's essentially a sort of fragility in the firms that if they're just looking at who's jumping ship now, they're not going to realize that they have these people who are still around but have reacted in some way, who are leaving maybe next year or later. Okay, and then when we split this out, it turns out that this is driven by firms that are far from bankruptcy. For firms that are near bankruptcy, everyone expands their networks because everyone's a little bit worried about what might be coming next. Something else that we can do within the set of individuals who are leaving this year. Now this gets noisier because we are looking at fewer individuals, right? We're already restricting to individuals who are leaving. We can look at when they leave, do they move to a position that's higher seniority, so they're moving up, or do they move to a position that's lower seniority than the one they left? So in red is leaving to higher seniority, in black is leaving to lower seniority. Error bands here are large, so the shaded areas are 95% confidence intervals. You can see that there gets a lot noisier. But there's still kind of an interesting pattern where among those who are leaving, the increase in abnormal networking activity is especially pronounced for those who are leaving to higher seniority positions. I will also note, though, that there is a little bit more of a pre-trend among this group. So, you know, take this analysis with a grain of salt. And then last but not least, on this kind of individual heterogeneity, what we can look at is, where are they now? Is this driven by entry-level employees? Is this driven by really senior employees, something in between? So again, we're going to split within a firm, we're going to split individuals into 3 groups. Black is the most junior group of employees, entry-level employees. Red is anyone who's in a more sort of senior associate, manager position, and then yellow is your most senior group of employees. And you actually see a response across all 3 groups, but you see the most response among individuals who are a little bit more senior. You know, these are individuals that if they're actually jumping ship, if this networking activity is predicting that they leave, this is pretty costly for firms, right? That they're losing some of their some of the employees that are the hardest to replace, that maybe have the most organizational capital. Okay, again, I'm going to just pause here briefly to see if there's any questions that have come up.
Yeah, I actually have a quick question. So this is really interesting. Like, sort of losing these senior employees at times of risk seems like it could create some sort of like, downward spiral. Is that is that how we should be thinking about it in terms of like the impact on the firm?
Yeah, and so at the end, I'll get into our results on what happens to firms are a little bit more speculative because we can't identify it quite as cleanly. But it does seem like if you have more abnormal, for a firm that has more abnormal connection activity, there are worse outcomes.
Fascinating. Cool. Thanks.
Okay, so let me then say a little bit about different types of events. So we've already talked about within credit events, if you're already close to bankruptcy or further away from bankruptcy. But what about, just negative economic news in general? So we look at, again, this is not going to be comprehensive, but we looked at least two other types of negative economic news for the firm. One is when the firm misses earnings. So we look at kind of the bottom decile of errors relative to consensus forecast, which just means the firm has missed earnings pretty substantially. Okay, so this is generally seen as a bad signal for the firm, but it doesn't have to do with their debt or anything. And then the other thing we look at is if their equity is downgraded by equity analysts. So, their equity trading in the market, if equity analysts say, this is no longer a buy, this is now a sell, we're going to look at those events as well. And the reason we picked these two events, in addition to being two events that we could measure, is that the stock market response to these events is on par with the stock market response to negative credit news. So we were trying to pick something that we could say, okay, stock market participants are reacting about similarly to these different types of news. Well, what about the firm's employees? Are they also responding the same way to these different types of events, or do they have different priorities than what we see in the stock market? So all relative to each other. So in gray, I've shown you just as a benchmark, this was our line for the abnormal networking activity relative to negative credit watch events. Blue and green on this graph are abnormal networking activity relative to missed earnings or equity sell recommendations. But you can see that it's not mechanical, right? The abnormal networking activity doesn't really show up, or it doesn't seem like there's abnormal networking activity following these other types of events in general. So there is something about different types of events causing different types of responses in terms of networking activity. The other thing that for me as a financial economist is interesting is to say that, yeah, maybe shareholders are responding the same way to these different types of events, but that doesn't mean that we can infer that employees are responding the same way to all three sets of events. Okay, so, and again, in the paper, we have more on why exactly we think this is the case. It turns out that, if you're curious, it turns out that following negative credit news, firms make more operational adjustments. So they're more likely to announce, spin-offs or sales in order to avoid more credit deterioration. And they are less likely to have that kind of substantial response to missed earnings or equity sell recommendations. And so we think that that's really what workers are anticipating. That's why they're expanding on their, they're really focused on expanding their networks after negative credit news. Okay. Okay, so last thing, as Scott mentioned, we want to know, what does this mean practically for firms? And like I said, there's going to be a little bit, more limited stuff that we can do here, but we want to do what we can. Just to recap what we have so far, we've seen that that connection making activity is highest for employees who end up leaving, including employees who are promoted elsewhere, right, who leave to higher seniority positions, including pretty senior level employees. So this would suggest that this is not a good thing for firms. And so in order to get at this a little bit more directly, we're going to create annual event studies to look at what happens to firms that have higher abnormal networking responses. So we're going to take our set of treated firms, so firms that experienced a negative credit event in a given year, and then we're going to split those treated firms into those that had an above median connection rate and below median connection rate. So it's pretty, crude way of doing things, but it will get us some information. Then we're going to compare different outcomes for the high connection response and the low connection response firms. I want to be clear that we're no longer going to be making causal statements here, because it's very possible that employees are connecting more because they know somehow that the news is worse, even though we can't observe any difference in the credit news. They might be, so there might be some endogeneity there, but it can at least tell us if this connection activity is picking something up, right? So here's what we do with the departure rate. So now I've changed the axes on this graph. On the y-axis, I'm now looking at abnormal departure rates, not connection activity. On the x-axis, I'm looking at years, right? No longer looking at weeks, because we only have departure rates at an annual level. And the two groups that I'm showing are in black, I have low abnormal activity in the treated year, and in red, I have high abnormal connection activity. And it does look like there is something about the firms that have high abnormal connection activity, right? So that's the red line. Their departure rates, the departure rates are pretty close together for these two types of firms leading up to the negative credit event. And then after the negative credit event, you see that firms where there was a high abnormal connection response, those are the ones that really have worse departure rates. When I say worse departure rates, I mean more employees leaving. In the firms that have low connection activity, you don't actually see any change in departure rates. So again, I can't say that the connections cause the departure activity, but we can at least say that they're picking something up that is a real outcome. The other outcome that we can look at in addition to departures is profitability. Again, this is measured at an annual level. So again, my x-axis is just years before and after the negative event. And the y-axis this time is cumulative abnormal profitability. So again, leading up to the negative credit event, we've got pretty similar profitability levels for the two types of firms. Then we've got this shock. Some firms have higher abnormal connection activity than others. Those are the firms in red. Well, those are the firms that end up having worse profitability in the years to come. And that difference stabilizes after a few years, but the gap never closes, or at least not for 4 years after. So again, what we take away from this is that the connection activity really does predict real differences. Okay, so I'm a little bit earlier than I thought I would be. Maybe I spoke a little bit fast. I do have a lot of additional work and robustness that I'm happy to go in, but let me just pause and see if maybe there are some questions I can answer. No? Scott, I see you're unmuted. Did you have something?
Well, I was going to say, if we get to vote on the robustness, I'd love to see some of the robustness checks, but I'd also love to see a little bit of the model, just out of personal interest.
Sure.
So if we get to vote, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Well, no one else is voting, so I'll go with your suggestion. So again, this is a model to try to explain why it is that individuals are connecting following negative credit events, but why are they connecting both close to bankruptcy and far from bankruptcy? Again, this is us coming from a bit of a finance background. So we've got, we're going to have two types of agents. This is a pretty simple model. We're going to have two types of agents in the model, the firm and the worker. Firm is characterized by its financial health. Worker is characterized by some ability A. And what happens in response to credit deterioration is that the firm can choose an action to maximize profits. This action is going to reduce credit risk, but it's also going to use resources that are needed by a long-term project. The worker is going to choose a search effort X to maximize his or her utility. And this search effort increases the worker's chances of moving to an outside opportunity. Okay, so we've got the firm characterized by financial health, and this is a function of baseline health, the credit deterioration shock, and the firm's action. Conditional on no default, the firm produces a value that is W plus the value of a long-term project. And this long-term project depends both on the firm's action and on the worker's ability. So the firm's action, remember that it can choose to take after the credit shock, is going to take some resources from that long-term project. So that's why it's negative here. Worker's ability enters positively in producing value. So that's the key part, is that the action can improve financial health but reduce the success of the long-term project. The worker earns a payoff that is that baseline value plus a share of the long-term project. So at the heart of this model is that you've got workers who care about the long-term prospects at the firm. And as you can already sort of see it shaping up as the firm takes actions to shore up their credit right now, their financial health right now, that's going to take away from the long-term project. And if I'm a high ability worker, that increases my incentives to search for outside opportunities. Okay, so to get to kind of the equations that the worker and the firm each solve, you've got for the worker a utility that depends on the value if they remain versus the value if they move. The value if they remain is this baseline value plus the long-term project with action Y that the firm has taken. If they move, they're earning, this is their outside opportunity elsewhere. This is their wage plus their outside opportunity, the value of the outside opportunity elsewhere, which depends on their ability. The firm solves its profit maximization function, which is, again, if they don't default, or if they don't lose the worker, their remaining share, sigma was the share of the long-term project that workers continue to hold. So their production of the long-term project minus the share that they've paid out to workers. So in terms of the timeline, you've got T equals 1, this credit deterioration that's going to enter into the financial health of the firm. The firm chooses Y, the worker chooses X, each kind of anticipating the equilibrium action of the other agent. And then at T equals 3, the project matures and opportunity sets are determined, outcomes are realized. So you're going to end up with a situation where the worker's search effort depends on the value of the outside option relative to the value of the inside option. So I keep moving around the pictures in Zoom so that I can see what I'm showing you. Sorry, where was I? So sorry, I started with the worker. Let me talk about the firm first. So the firm is going to choose an optimal Y in response to that credit deterioration that depends on its baseline financial health, the credit shock. Essentially, the firm is trying to survive. The worker takes that action as given, and if they're high enough ability, which is this A, they're going to have a relatively higher option value, outside option value. And so they're going to increase their search effort, which is this X. And so that's why you end up having search effort both close to bankruptcy and far from bankruptcy. Okay, I think that's
super cool. It's really interesting. I mean, I guess a follow-up question is, so what would you tell a firm, given this evidence, like, you know, a firm that's approaching bankruptcy, like, or you know, even just like a negative, even like entering into a negative market, right? Like a lot of tech firms are currently, you know, sort of facing big shocks to their cash flows, and you know, are making decisions to try and become, you know, to like reinforce their cash flows by investing in, you know, short run, you know, sort of various short run innovations. What would you tell them? I mean, like, this actually suggests that like that's a really like a worse long-term strategy than you might have otherwise imagined.
Yeah, so I think that's you know, in our model, it's not necessarily the firm's choice of Y is it's what's the term I'm looking, like they understand that by taking resources away from the long-term project, that they're going to lose some workers who are just saying like, well, I didn't come to work at Google X, you know, to not work on like moonshot projects, right? Like that. That's the idea that we have in mind. So you know, then these individuals are going to start looking elsewhere. But like the firm knows this, but still, like if they go bankrupt, you know, that's
true. Yeah, exactly. If they go bankrupt, they're out of luck. So
right. So I can't say that like I guess I have two different responses. One is, in the model, they're not doing anything wrong. It's just, you know, it's just luck of the draw. They got this bad financial health draw, and that's what they have to do. I guess changing hats to say in practice, I think what this suggests is for firms to be very careful about both how they're managing expectations relating to long-term projects and kind of what they're I do think honestly, and I don't know how much we can show this in the data, but I do think honestly that firms do not appreciate how much workers are paying attention to what's happening and are looking at potential outside options, even when they're not moving immediately. And so I think the first step is for firms to know this is going on, right? And once they know that this is going on, then they can come up with, maybe there's a way to, even though they're going to take resources away from the long-term project, maybe there's something they can do to continue to give incentives to workers to say, but you know, if you stick around, there are real advantages to that.
Super interesting. This is really cool, and will legitimately, like, you know, change the way I like talk to companies. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just I'll go ahead and conclude and maybe, you know, I think I was slated to go for another 4 minutes, so I'll just give a couple minutes back. So just, you know, what we're doing in this paper is trying to capitalize on this new type of data that's being collected to answer some longstanding questions. We find that network formation increases after negative news, particularly about a firm's financial health. Other events don't necessarily trigger similar reactions for employees. That networking activity is associated with leaving, and not just immediately, but in future years as well. And that's especially true for firms that are not necessarily close to bankruptcy. It's especially true for more senior individuals, individuals leaving to higher seniority positions. So high quality, what we think of are high quality individuals if they're being promoted elsewhere. And we think there is this potential for a feedback effect between networking and financial deterioration, where we see that reactions lead to more departures, but also companies that have that stronger connection activity that correlates with worse profitability. Again, we can't say that's causal, but just that there is something that's being picked up by that networking activity. So hopefully this gives some food for thought for what else can be done with this kind of data. And if you have thoughts or suggestions, I'm happy to hear them.
Awesome. Any further questions? I know I sort of monopolized by asking a bunch of questions during the talk, but I just thought that was totally fascinating. Really, really cool.
Well, I will turn it over to, is it Martin next?
I think so. Sergiy, you're
it's Miles.
Right?
Miles is
Oh, Miles,
going
I'm
to be
sorry.
next.
Miles is up next. Let's thank Jessica one more time. Let's get the applause emotes in the chat and so forth. Thank you so much, especially for joining us late in the day in Europe.
Thank you. Okay, Miles, are you ready to start a bit earlier?
Yeah, I can start now.
Okay,
whenever works.
Let me then introduce you, and we'll start just a little bit earlier, and you'll have more time to. I'm sure you have a lot of things to talk about.
Sure.
With so many fresh papers coming out of your production line. Okay, so our next speaker is Miles Cranmer. Miles is based at Princeton, and he is a rising star in astrophysics there. Miles focuses on developing and applying new machine learning methods that can be used beyond his own field. Check out his publications. They're accessible even if you never touched physics since high school. But at the same time, they're very, very illuminating and thought-provoking. And today he will give us a taste of this exciting line of research.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm super excited to be talking to you all today. So today I'm going to talk a bit about kind of like a problem I see with the use of machine learning in not just physics, but I think science broadly. And I think I'll present kind of my take on how we can try to address this problem. So the solution is interpretability. So I'll talk about this. Okay, so I'll just start off by saying, like, why do we need interpretable machine learning? So I really think machine learning, it's very good at finding patterns in high dimensional data sets. I really think it has huge potential to accelerate science. I really feel like it'll be the next kind of computer science, where it's just in all departments we do machine learning. The same way we use computers in every scientific field. So I really think it has huge potential for science. I think one of the nicest applications thus far has been the AlphaFold model from DeepMind, which, for those who don't know, it solved the problem of going from a protein sequence to a folded protein structure. That was like an unsolved problem for 5 decades, and they finally passed, I guess, the experimental threshold or something. So I think we'll start to see more and more of these kind of alpha folds for different fields, and I'm really excited about that. I do think that there's a key difference between engineering and science So in science, even if you gave a scientist, you just gave them like an oracle that just perfectly predicts the world, every single phenomena it could predict perfectly. I think as a scientist, you wouldn't be satisfied with that. Like that would be awesome, but as a scientist, you want to know why. You want to understand the underlying reasons for things being predictable. So where's the scientific insight in machine learning? Can we learn something from this? So I'll give there was a bit of machine learning, especially in the first talk. I'll just give like a lightning quick intro to kind of refresh things. So linear regression, or fitting a line of best fit to data, is actually an example of machine learning. That's kind of the simplest example. So you fit some linear model, you fit a parameter m, a parameter b, and your model's mx plus b. You fit it to data. Maybe you minimize the squared error of that model. Machine learning is basically the same thing. It's basically just like curve fitting, but your curve, which in this case is a line, machine learning, that curve is just very expressive and high dimensional. That's the key difference with machine learning. And they have like millions or billions, sometimes even a couple trillion parameters, but they're still very efficient to train. So I'll just give a quick maybe demo of how a neural network actually works. So this is called TensorFlow Playground. It's this interactive demo of neural networks. Basically, what we want to do here is put those orange points in the orange region and the blue points in the blue region. Okay, so it's a classification problem. The way we do this is our model is equal to tanh of a times x1 plus b times x2. So x1 is the x-axis, x2 is the y-axis. So we want to fit a, which is represented by this line. We want to fit b, which is represented by this line. So blue is a positive number, orange is a negative number. So let's fit this model. So you can see it trains and quickly finds that a and b should both be positive numbers, and that gives you the correct separation. So now those points are classified. So if we just take this model and we try to fit something more complex. So here we have this ring of orange points and this inner circle of blue points. We try to do this with our same linear model. We can't, right? It gets the optima for this is like 0 for A, 0 for B. You can't really separate those points well. Okay, so what we do, and this is kind of where deep learning comes into the picture. So rather than doing a regression to the output with just a couple numbers, now we kind of repeat the process. So we first fit these intermediate numbers. So here we have ax plus bx2. Then we have different parameters, so C and D, different parameters E and F. This gives us 3 numbers, okay? These are the intermediate values. In deep learning literature, you call this the hidden layer or the latent vector. Then what we do is, using those intermediate values, we then take those intermediate values and run the same model on them. So in this case, we have G y1, H y2, I y3, and we fit those parameters. And so you're basically doing recursive logistic regression, and this lets you express much more complex functions. So let's fit this one. And you can see it quickly finds that one of these intermediate values is kind of like this line here. One of these represents this line here. One of them represents this line here. And then they kind of all get stacked together, you see here. And this is basically how modern deep learning works. You just have more intermediate values. So you have more layers in your neural network. And you also extend it this way. So you have more neurons per layer. So typically, like you could have like billions of nodes in the most complex models, and you can represent very complex functions. So let's see if we can get this spiral. So this orange spiral and this blue spiral inside of it. Let's see if we can fit this. And you can see, so it starts off a bit slowly, but gradually starts getting there. And you can see again, these neurons, the first layer is kind of representing the linear combinations. And then you get the nonlinear combinations in the second layer, which are kind of superpositions of the first. And this is how it builds up complexity. And you can see, okay, so now it's kind of fit the spiral. But this is great from like an engineering perspective. We can fit very complex functions like this very quickly. But from a scientist perspective, this leaves much to be desired. So if I ask you, like, what's the relationship between these points and this neuron, it's complex to answer that, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's kind of a lot of superposition of different components, and you're not really sure like what does what. And it kind of goes back to the case of like we have this oracle that can predict everything super accurately, but what does that mean for science? And so this is kind of what interpretable machine learning starts addressing. So let me show you an example of, I guess, why I think we need interpretable machine learning. So if you look at the history of science, so there's this thing called Kepler's third law. Basically, the period of a planet is squared is related to the cube of the semi-major axis of a planet around the sun. This actually is what inspired Newton to find his law of gravitation. It wasn't an apple. I mean, I think it's a cute story, but it was actually Kepler's third law that inspired this to kind of explain that empirical observation. So a similar story is actually for Planck's law. So this describes the spectrum of light from a black body, similar to the sun. This was actually empirically found. This law was kind of fit this function to data, and this would require quantum mechanics to kind of explain Planck's law. So my problem with deep learning is that if you just look at like a neural network's weights, you don't really have this interpretability. You can't derive a theory to kind of explain the neural network's weights, right? Like it's really tricky to go to kind of inspire new theories in physics from a deep learning model, say. So I think many algorithms used by industry, like, I mean, they're very good for engineering, but I don't know if they're suitable for scientific discovery. So we had this recent paper led by Kim Stackenfield at DeepMind, where we looked at predicting turbulent simulations. So you have this turbulent fluid, and you try to predict the dynamics of it. You train a neural network to kind of emulate that process, and the neural network finds a faster way to do it. So it's like 1,000 times speed up compared to a coarse numerical code that's like highly optimized. If you train a neural network to do the same thing, it can do it much faster. And so this is great from an engineering perspective, but from a scientific perspective, like how did the model actually get there? Like what knowledge is there that we can gain from this and kind of build on our existing theories of turbulence? So, okay, that's kind of the motivation for why we want interpretable machine learning. But okay, so what is traditionally used in machine learning for interpretation? So traditional interpretation kind of all revolves around this thing called saliency. So saliency is like the sensitivity of a model to changes in the inputs. So if I have this, like, so you could define it as the gradient of a model F with respect to the inputs. That's kind of one way of defining this. And so if I have this model that kind of classifies different animals, the salience tells me, okay, if I change this pixel, how does it change the classification of the animal? So that's saliency, and that's traditionally how a lot of different machine learning interpretability approaches work. Is you look at the sensitivity to different inputs. So another example is this thing called Shapley values, which is also it's kind of like a more rigorous way of measuring feature importances. There's this nice GitHub package if you want to check it out. But again, this is all about kind of feature importances in the model. And I think like saliency is really useful for computer vision and natural language processing. So one interesting example is there was this this paper that recognized, or I think it was a neural network paper that detected pneumonia in hospital patients. And what they found by looking at the saliency map is that it wasn't looking at the lungs at all. It was looking at the text in the background of the image, which was like highly correlated with the diagnosis, like rather than looking at the lungs. So I think it's like a really useful debugging tool, but I wouldn't say it gives us physical insights. So like, if you think back to Kepler, I don't think he would have found Kepler's laws by looking at feature importances. Like even if you have those, you know what features matter, it still doesn't give you that kind of geometrical understanding. So that's kind of a motivation. Like, yeah, I really think like feature importances are they help explain things, but they're kind of the minimum. But in science, we need kind of like a full model to explain things. That's what we really want as scientists. So one important difference between these approaches is like computer vision, there's not the same level of models as a lot of the say natural sciences. So like if I give you a picture of a cat, there's no equation that describes the cat, right? Like I can't create a generative model of cats by writing down a formula. I mean, that would be cool, but it doesn't exist. Whereas science, we have like a great analytic understanding of many, many phenomena. So like this is a gravitational wave example, but you could look at like a physics 101 cheat sheet, and so many of these equations are just simple analytic relations, and they're very accurate. It's just simple symbolic mathematics is like a great modeling language for science, and we don't really have that for computer vision. So I think that's the main difference. So I think in science, when we want to interpret a deep learning model, rather than trying to distill like feature importances or stuff like that, I think we should try to express it in our existing language of science, which is mathematical expressions. That's how we describe our models already. So I think when we find new knowledge, we should try to express it in our kind of old language. And that helps us think about new observations. You could also argue like, so in our 2020 paper on discovering symbolic models, we also found like, even aside from interpretability, analytic models often generalize better than neural networks. And there's other papers that look at this too. And I think the reason why a simple symbolic model generalizes so well, and you see this through all of physics, is because a lot of the core operators in symbolic models, they have these geometrical properties. So like if you look at a plus symbol, like you think about adding numbers, there's actually like adding numbers is kind of like it's not built into our brains. Like plus, multiplication, those are not like built-in operators in our brains. It's just we learn that plus and multiplication are useful for describing the world. And that's why we think of them as simple. And I think the reason why these operators are so useful for describing the world is because they have these geometrical properties. So like a plus, if you think about just like adding numbers, it's kind of like translating things in space, counting things. Like it has this very physical structure to it. Same with multiplication. You can think of like a length becomes area, becomes volume. Exponentials, that is a solution to many differential equations throughout the universe. So I think like just searching for models that are representable as like simple analytic expressions is both good for interpretability and for like generalization. Okay, so I'll talk about symbolic regression now. So symbolic regression is kind of, it's an automated way of finding equations that describe something. So the work goes back to like Patrick Langley, Koza did some work on this, the first like genetic algorithms for equation discovery, Hod-Lipson. The basic way it works is if you have a data set of like X values, Y values, and maybe an output value, and you want to find the relationship between those numbers, you could do like a traditional machine learning approach, or you could do a symbolic regression approach. You define a set of symbols, so like plus, maybe cosine, maybe X and Y, so those are like your variables. Symbolic regression is basically a way to take those symbols, arrange them to represent an expression that matches your data set. So it's an automated way of finding equations that describe your data well. So I have this code called Piser, which is like a high performance symbolic regression in Python, if you want to try it out. It's kind of like a scikit-learn API. So like traditional machine learning methods. It lets you define like custom operators, custom losses, constraints. Like if you have some operator that's kind of weird, but everybody in your field uses it, you could define that in Piser. The way Piser and other genetic algorithms work is they represent an equation as a tree. So this equation, y equals z plus 2 sine z, you can write it down as this binary tree, right? The plus operator has child z, child multiplication, and this whole thing is represented as a tree. This also represents a function, right, over z that you could match to data. So the way the genetic algorithm comes in is it gives you a way of exploring this space of expressions by manipulating the tree. So maybe I have a plus operator here, maybe I mutate it to a minus sign, or maybe I take the z variable, I switch it with an x variable. So these are different mutations I might apply. You could also do crossbreeding. So this is, again, motivated by how evolution works. So it's a genetic algorithm. So maybe I have this expression and this expression. They're both like not too bad fits. So what I'll do is I'll take some part of my tree, another part of the other tree, and I'll switch them. And now I have two children expressions. And this is a way of kind of reusing parts of equations that are useful and kind of using it to search this space of expressions. So these are ways of exploring the space of equations in an efficient way. So the way Piser works is it uses this tree-based approach, which is kind of like a classic approach to parallelism in genetic algorithms. You basically have these different islands of expressions. So maybe this island is specialized in exponential functions. This island is specialized in polynomials. Each island, it's really like evolution. Like each island evolves independently. And the reason they evolve independently is that lets you parallelize it over CPUs. Like you could have one island on one core, one island on another core, and they kind of evolve separately.
Miles, sorry to interrupt. There is a question that would be useful for people's understanding. People are asking, do we have the prefixed set of functions that we choose from, or do we assume that we know them and we only consider those functions that are applicable in specific problem?
So you have a fixed set of operators, and your function space is basically all trees of those operators and variables up to a maximum complexity. You can also define it for like real numbers, and you would have like one node is a real number and it could kind of take on any value. And that's how you define your function space.
And another clarifying question is how large is the set of operators? I remember that you have all the standard operators. So
yeah, so
can you talk?
Yeah, so the standard set is like usually I only use like 7 operators, like plus, multiplication, division, minus. I mean, that's like many functions in physics, actually. I also have like exponential, cosine, like tanh, maybe. And you can represent like many different expressions with that. So Piser also lets you define custom operators. So if you give it like a string, which represents the function, it can even have like if statements. It doesn't need to be continuous. And it will kind of compile that into an operator for you, if that answers the question. Because often like in a specific subfield, you might have some operator, like maybe you have Bezel functions appearing everywhere. And so you might want to like define a Bezel function, which Julia, so the backend of Piser is written in Julia, and Julia has like a Bezel function module that you could then put in as an operator. Yeah, okay. So that's how you do the parallelism. You have separate islands of expressions that kind of evolve independently. After a number of generations, you have this migration period between islands. So one island kind of sends its best expressions to random other islands. And that process of kind of scattering the expressions around helps improve the diversity of expressions. So maybe this one's like specialized, and so maybe you send in some polynomials once in a while to kind of introduce new types of functions. Yeah, so this algorithm is it's called the tournament selection. So I think tournament selection even goes back to the maybe early 80s. So there's a couple tweaks in Piser. Okay, so basically the way it works is if you have this population of expressions, you randomly subsample some expressions. Maybe you sample 2 expressions. Of those 2 expressions, you compute the fittest expression. So you maybe score them by their loss or maybe a complexity penalty. So you score them, select the fittest expression, and then you could do a few different manipulations to that expression. So maybe one is you mutate it. Maybe you take the y and you square it. Maybe you change a constant. You can also do, so these are the Piser tweaks. So maybe you could have a simplification step, or you could also have a round of constant optimization. So this is, you basically have some constants in your equation and you just explicitly optimize those. That could be another type of manipulation. And once the equation is manipulated, you put it back on the island and you kill off the oldest expression. So like a lot of it really tries to mimic evolution, because we know evolution is like it created us. So it must be like good at something. So maybe it could find equations. So this is how the loop kind of happens. So there's recently a symbolic regression competition at Gecko conference. So this is actually by Bill LaCava, who's at Harvard Medical School. He kind of led this competition. So Piser got second overall, but it found like the simplest expressions, which I was happy about. So a really interesting thing about that competition is like there were quite a few deep learning methods entered into the competition, but all the winners are based on evolution, which I thought was really, really interesting. Like it seems like this type of algorithm really hasn't been beaten by deep learning yet. I mean, I think it will eventually, but it's interesting, like a lot of the winning approaches are kind of based on this evolutionary strategy. I think it's really just like the space of equations, all possible equations, is so large that it's really hard to kind of train a deep learning strategy to do this. Okay, so the next part, I'm going to talk about how we could actually use this symbolic regression strategy to interpret a neural network. So the basic principle is you try to find symbolic models that approximate your neural network. So if you have this is like a representation of a neural network. If you train it on some phenomena, could be anything, you would basically train it normally. So maybe it's like predicting how particles move in space. Maybe it's predicting, like as Sergiy works on, maybe it's predicting like the GDP or trade of countries. So you train it normally. Then what you do is you record the inputs and outputs of this neural network. So you're kind of watching the neural network work. So like it's doing some computation and you're watching the inputs and outputs. So you record these. Then what you do is you treat the neural network like it's kind of some function you want to approximate. So you take those observations and you fit them with, say, Piser. So you fit the inputs and outputs, and maybe you recover some expression like this that kind of approximates your neural network. And this kind of gives you a more powerful strategy of interpreting a network, because now you don't just get the importance of different features, but you also get how those features kind of work together inside the neural network. So the really powerful strategy for this is when you have a very complex neural network. And it kind of has like different pieces. So maybe like this piece is computing the interaction between two particles, and maybe this piece is like updating the velocity of one of the particles. So you can use this strategy to interpret pieces of a neural network. And at the end, you would kind of compose these expressions together to get an equivalent symbolic expression. I see there's a question. I don't know. Yeah, feel free to, Sergiy, feel free to ask any questions that come up. This is kind of like, actually, I think I'll come back to this later. Basically, the reason you wouldn't want to do symbolic regression directly is because the space of expressions is so big, it can be very hard to find expressions that are like very complex. And what this deep learning does, it kind of breaks the problem into smaller pieces that you can then interpret. So I'll give an example of this later so it becomes a bit more clear. Okay, so let me talk about some examples now. Hopefully this helps illustrate how this actually works. So these are some like pure Piser approaches. So this is Helen Xiao. Her paper was basically finding relationships in the mass of dark matter subhalos, maybe using velocity dispersion. And so they found this new expression. This is another paper by Jay Wadekar. He's finding like ionization relationships in dark matter halos. So these are kind of like astro examples, but it's actually discovering new equations, whereas normally we'd have to find these by hand, which is interesting. Actually, let me skip this one. So this is a paper by Sergiy and Michael Douglas here. And so this was a really interesting paper where they tried to find new symbolic equations for kind of modeling international trade. So I guess this is a classic equation where the trade between two countries is kind of related to the product of their GDP. And they try to find like new expressions, which I thought was really cool. And I thought it was a really nice application. So I'll talk about another example in more detail here. We wanted to see in this paper if we could discover Newton's law of gravity just from data. So just by observing the motion of planets in the solar system, can we recover the law of gravity? So in this setting, we don't know the dynamical model and we don't know the masses. We don't have the masses of the planets, right? Because like you need gravity to kind of infer the masses. So we don't know the masses, we don't know the dynamical model. So this is led by Pablo Lemos, who's now at Montreal. So the basic way this algorithm works is given a position of every planet, you have the position of every planet, you want to try to predict the acceleration of every planet. You also have like the sun and various moons too. Now, what you introduce is you say, okay, every planet and moon now has some parameter. There's some parameter VI that describes each planet. You don't know what it is. You don't have a model for it. You just have some parameter, okay? You also have this unknown dynamical model, which is a function of the displacement between two planets and their parameters. Okay, so this could become Newton's law of gravity, but for it to happen, it needs to learn that this parameter is mass. It needs to learn that this function is Newton's law of gravity. Okay. So the way this actually is trained, you have this learned force law here, which takes in the displacement between planet I and planet J. Okay, so if we're modeling the acceleration of planet I, we sum over all the other planets. So we sum over all the other planets. So the function we're summing depends on the displacement between the planets, the mass of planet J and the mass of planet I, or like whatever other parameter this could be. So the way this is actually possible, the only reason this is possible is because you learn F and VI simultaneously. So you learn F by gradient descent, and you also learn VI. So you're learning these parameters of the planets simultaneously. So we use NASA's Horizons data. It's basically like a library of all the positions of bodies in the solar system. We use the sun, planets, all the moons with mass above 10 to the 18 kilograms. This gives us 31 bodies. We have the dynamics of 31 bodies. We assign them like 31 unknown parameters that we need to infer. We also need to infer the law. So we give it 30 years of data to train this. Okay, so this is the first approach. So this is like just the neural network, no symbolic stuff yet. Let's see how it does. So in this diagram, the predictions are the wireframe, and the predictions are the wireframe, and the colored body is the ground truth. Of course, it's not to scale, obviously. So you can see like the initial predictions, it does something, but it's not that good. So you can see like these are the connections between bodies, where it has to learn the dynamical function between the bodies, right? So the first model wasn't that good, but it's not too bad. So we tried this approach. Let's take this learned network and try to interpret it. Okay, so we have this learned function f. Let's see if we can interpret it, right? So we approximate the input and output of f with symbolic regression. And this is what we get. So the simplest law we find is x over r. So this is the force along the x direction. We then find x over r plus a constant. So again, not Newton's law. X over r times r plus a constant. Not there yet. Okay, other ones. So this is Newton's law of gravity. So constant times mass parameter 1 times mass parameter 2 times x over r cubed. So this is the true force along the x direction. We also find one more expression, which is actually more accurate, which is this expression, which is plus a constant. But if we use, so the y-axis here shows the accuracy complexity trade-off. It's basically like, it's this formula that penalizes complexity, basically. So you can see that this metric, which is, I think it goes back like, I don't know, some decades, but this metric correctly identifies Newton's law of gravity as the kind of like the best expression. The most accurate expression is this one, the black one, but you can see like the additional accuracy is just like not worth it at all. So the metric does not prefer that one at all. I mean, of course, like we know Newton's law of gravity. The reason we're interested in this is we want to see, like, can we find it without giving any or giving minimal prior information to the model. Okay, so we take this symbolic model, plug it back in to the neural network setup. Okay, so let's see this. And so it actually does a bit better, right? Like you can see those wireframes are kind of more closely tracking the true planets, but it's still not perfect. So like you can see with Mercury, like the predictions are actually kind of far away. Okay, so why isn't this working well? So if you remember, the neural network is simultaneously learning the dynamical model and the parameters of every planet. So we can look at those parameters and see if they're actually the mass parameters. Like, is it actually inferring things that are mass? And it turns out like those are pretty bad. So the ground truth values here are in blue and the predictions are in red. The different dots are basically different times we ran the model. But surprisingly, like many of the moons and planets are off of the true values. So it seems like the neural network, since these are so expressive, it's kind of learning its own Newton's law of gravity that works like given its mass parameters, but doesn't work with the true mass parameters. So what we did is we said, okay, well, now that we've replaced the symbolic model, or now that we've replaced the neural network by the symbolic model, why don't we refit the parameters of every planet and see if that improves it? Because like we know now it's Newton's law of gravity, but the symbolic model is not a perfect approximation of the neural network, right? It's an approximation. So we really should have parameters that fit that symbolic model. So we redid that, and that works much better. So this is the predicted dynamics after. So we replaced the neural network by the symbolic model, and then we retune those parameters, and it's much better. So I mean, like you can't even see the wireframe separate there. I mean, of course, like we expect that because it is Newton's law of gravity, but again, we learned it with minimal prior information. And now we can look at the mass parameters again, and now they're right on target. So all of the planets are like perfect. Many of the moons are very good. Some of the moons are a bit weird, like Hyperion. The mass parameters are kind of over predicted. Same for Phoebe. And we looked at why this is, and it turns out it's just like gravitational influence. Those masses are so tiny, they don't really influence other bodies in the system. So you just can't do the inference that well, which makes sense. Yeah, I mean, most of them are inferred pretty well. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about this example with the gravitational law. Again, we know Newton's law of gravity, but you need somewhere to start to kind of validate the methods, right? You have to validate, it can discover known laws before you go and discover new laws. So what we're working on now is we have this turbulent model that can get 1,000 times speed up on this fluid simulation. So right now we're trying to figure out like how it actually found that model. So like, what is the effective model of the physics for this turbulent simulation? So we're working on that a bit now. I'll just skip through this really quick. Basically, this is Navier-Stokes equation. And we think the neural network is learning Navier-Stokes, but this term here on the right side, this is a part that is, you traditionally model this because you don't have like perfect resolution of your fluid. So you typically model this term in the equation. So we think that the neural network has learned a good model for this part. Now what we're trying to do is extract the symbolic model for that part, because that would tell us something about turbulence. So I'll just go through this. So we've so far like found known models for, like if we plug in a ground truth expression here, we can recover it. And what's left is to just find new turbulent models. So we're working on that now. Okay, in summary, I think we as scientists should use deep learning to find new insights rather than just make black box predictions. Like I think as scientists, we are interested in understanding why things are the way they are. The approach I showed you today is you structure your machine learning in a way that is kind of similar to existing scientific frameworks, and you kind of translate it to symbolic models. And this gives you kind of the insight into how these models work. And I think there's exciting future applications in many fields. I'm particularly interested right now in understanding turbulence and other physical systems. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for having me. Happy to take questions.
This is fascinating. Thank you, Miles. Let's see if we have any questions. In the meantime, a quick one from me. This resonates with what the first speaker, Xiaohong Chen, was talking about. that in economics we have low signal-to-noise ratios in the data.
Mhm.
So it's what happens often is that neural network would fit quite a bit of noise.
Right.
And obviously, you do not want your symbolic model to reproduce all that noise.
Yeah.
Do you have a good recipe of fighting with this?
Yeah, I think this, I mean, yeah, the proper treatment of noise is like, as a astronomer, like I like Bayesian approaches. I think in pure neural networks, there's Bayesian neural networks, which kind of give you a proper treatment of noise and data and gives you a more robust way to kind of regularize your neural network against noise. I think the symbolic point of view is trying to find, yeah, I think the symbolic point of view is you have this built-in Occam's razor where simple expressions are favored, and naturally those simple expressions will not fit like every single example of noise in your data. So it's kind of like a slightly different approach than traditional Bayesian methods for treating noise. I think also one interesting approach for symbolic regression is like actually fitting symbolic models of the noise source simultaneously with the expression. I think that's an interesting avenue that hasn't really been explored yet. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? We have a bit of long comments in the chat, but those are comments, those are not questions.
Want me? Okay, I can read it. Let me see. Okay. So Fred Dom says we should allow the AI to create new primitive operators. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, so how would we make machine learning kind of come up with new operators? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one avenue to this is I showed this approach where you have this hierarchy of neural networks and you kind of fit a symbolic expression to each of them. It might be that the first step is kind of like a coordinate transform, and the second one is like an operator. And you could think of the second one as like discovering a new operator, and the first one is like, I don't know, it's doing a coordinate transform. So that's one way of thinking of it. Like ultimately, to discover a new operator, we need we need existing math to represent the new operator. Obviously, I think like you could do things like you search for a symbolic integrand, and the integral of that integrand is the new operator. Like maybe that's an approach. You could kind of do this with this strategy where you train the neural network to fit the derivative of a neural network to some data, and the neural network has implicitly kind of integrated the data, and then you could fit the expression to that, and that would be kind of be like the integrand of your new operator. I mean, like maybe that's one way to do this. I think another approach is like fitting a series. Like if you represent your new operator as a series of symbolic expressions, maybe you could do a genetic algorithm on the series expansion. Maybe that's one way. But I think this is like very deep, and it's not really, like people haven't really explored this that well yet. But I think it's a really interesting question. I really think like neural networks are great at, they're kind of like always implicitly creating abstractions to to kind of compute things. So if we could understand the abstractions that a neural network has learned, maybe that's kind of equivalent to discovering new concepts.
Thank you very much, Miles. That was a very stimulating talk.
Thanks.
Okay, our next speaker is Dan Roberts. Let me, hi Dan, let me give an introduction of the next speaker. So Dan Roberts works on the intersection of theoretical physics and artificial intelligence. He is currently affiliated with the Center for Theoretical Physics at MIT, where he also got his PhD. Throughout his busy career, he was also involved with Facebook AI research, with Institute for Advanced Study, Cambridge and Oxford universities. Dan has founded a machine learning startup, DeepFil. Members of their team were inspired by the concept of diffeomorphism. So the audience here really appreciate that, I guess. But this was not just all fun and games. Eventually, it was procured by Salesforce, so it was doing something very useful. I would like also to mention his fresh off-the-press book, The Principles of Deep Learning Theory. And his today's talk will be about the natural scaling laws. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me here to give this talk. This is, I guess, my second virtual visit to the CMSA. I'd love to come in person at some point, but this is very exciting, very happy to be here. And I'm going to be giving a talk based on some upcoming work with Alex Maloney and Jamie Sully. And it's about, as I said, it's about trying to understand better neural scaling laws that were found in large language models. Large language models are a type of currently based on type of deep neural network, transformer, and they're trained on a large corpus of text to given an input prompt of text to predict the next word. And so in honor of them and giving a talk inspired by things that they do, I thought I would give myself the same sort of problem. So the sentence large language models are, and trying to predict what is the next word that comes to mind for me to give this introduction. So to start, large language models are exciting. That's the reason why I'm here giving this talk. And they're exciting because they're really, really good at language generation. And perhaps this is where I would tell you that the text of this talk was actually secretly written by GPT-3. Actually, it's not true, but the fact that maybe you at least had to consider or smile about that underscores the point that I want to make here. These models are really exciting. They're doing something very interesting, and so people are studying them. Large language models, the sort of next token that comes to mind, next word that comes to mind is that they're, well, large. They're large in kind of two important ways. They're large as in size. So the Megatron-Turing NLG, not quite sure what NLG stands for, but regardless, it has about 500 billion parameters. So that's gigantic. So they're large as in size. They're also large as in and as is the title of this conference, big data. The chinchilla model was trained on approximately 1.5 trillion tokens, and so they're both they're kind of large in these two different ways. And at least the way I thought about this is not a regime that's typically thought to be useful. Maybe when first learning about statistics in high school or something, we learn that we want our data to be large, but maybe we want the number of parameters to be small and fixed. And this is sort of the regime that's well studied in classical learning theory. There's a well-known bias and variance trade-off, and a notion that when we increase the number of parameters, things start to overfit. Then perhaps you learn something about deep learning, and you learn that deep learning is the regime of over-parameterization, where maybe the size of the training set is fixed, but we are interested in a limit where the number of parameters becomes large. And some of the work that I've done was exploring some of those regimes, and so that's sort of the over-parameterized, modern regime. And I guess the points that I want to make, and I'll come back to this, is that the regime in which these large language models are operating in seems to be very different. It's one where we're scaling both of these perhaps together. And the next thing that comes to mind is that large language models are predictable, although maybe it wouldn't come to your mind because it's sort of a surprising fact found by Jared Kaplan, Sam McCandlish, and some members of the team at OpenAI, they found empirical scaling laws in the test loss of these transformer-based large language models. Although I think now these scaling laws are much more broad than just large language models. We'll go into some explanations why. But so training large language models using some kind of regularization, early stopping, and they found across a wide variety of models and sizes extreme regularity. So this is a cartoon of what they found, but it's representative. And so it's a log-log plot. Here I plotted the size of the training set on the x-axis. On the y-axis, I've plotted the test loss, and for different sizes of models, different numbers of parameters. And we find these sort of very regular curves across these varieties of models and data set sizes. You can also plot it as a function of parameters. It sort of gives you similar behavior. So I'm just going to represent it this way. And so let's talk about the features of this plot, because understanding this is going to be part of the point of or a large part of my talk. So first of all, if we take the number of parameters to be very large so that it's not a bottleneck, we find that the test losses behaves as a power law with some sort of characteristic exponent. So that tells you that, if you have a large number of parameters so that it's larger than the other relevant scale, the training set size, then your performance will keep increasing in a characteristic way, which is exciting because it tells you basically how you can know in advance how good you're going to do without actually having to train. The other important feature is that when you restrict the number of parameters so that it creates, say, a bottleneck in the capacity, then the test loss plateaus also in a characteristic way, where the sort of final loss, the plateau that it asymptotes to, depends on the number of parameters that you have. So here I'm taking powers of some sort of fixed initial parameter, and we see that there's another exponent that describes this plateau. And so together, these features sort of characterize the performance of these models, and the authors of this study wrote down a simple equation that completely characterizes this over the regime that they were able to study empirically. And so there's kind of two constants you measure and then two exponents. And once you know that for a given parameter and training set size, you can predict how well the performance is going to be, which is kind of an impressive feat. And so, and then one interesting point about this is that, as I said in the beginning, if you have an infinite number of parameters, then you get this nice power law. But of course, you don't need an infinite number of parameters. You just kind of want to avoid this plateau bottleneck. So basically, you can stare at this equation and see that if you get both terms to essentially contribute equally, you can parameterize, say, one of the independent variables in terms of the other, like the parameters in terms of the training set size. And that says that scaling, if you have a given data set size, it tells you basically how large a model you need so that the performance continues to increase in the best that it can be. And so this is, I guess, the reason to make this point is that this is practically useful more than, it's more, in addition to just being an interesting scientific and theoretical question, this tells a practitioner, oh, I have a data set this big, how big a model do I need? What sort of resources do I need? And to do this, you just need to measure sort of these four constants, and then you can learn how to scale these things up. The other point that I want to make is this ratio is either 1 or close to 1 or often close to 1. And the sort of intuition here is that actually we want to scale both of these things together. And that goes back to what I said a few slides ago. And so the regime in which these things perform well is a regime where both of these things continue to be scaled up. So at least for me, this empirical behavior implies a number of theoretical questions, hopefully that I can address over the course of this talk. So the first is, what are the properties of natural data sets that lead to these scaling laws? It's easy to see. Well, given the formalism that I present, you can work it, or you can just do some experiments that for Gaussian data, for random noise, maybe a theorist's favorite type of data, you don't get scaling laws. So we need to go beyond sort of really simple models of data sets, and we actually need to model the data set. And so what are the properties that we need to capture say, the minimal properties of data sets that will lead to this sort of phenomenology that we saw on the last slide. Next, given that we have that sort of data, is there something special about transformers that allow for scaling laws, or is this sort of a more generic property of statistical models? So, I say which DNNs have scaling laws when trained on that data, but more broadly, I mean, what are the properties of statistical models or even random feature maps that allow for the scaling law phenomenology to arise? And so, given that, how do they arise? How is the statistics of, say, the random features transformed to give you the statistics of the test loss? What is the mechanism? And do they break down in the sense of, given that equation that I showed, just go back and flash again. So given an equation like this, is this valid for all NNT, or are there NNTs that cause the behavior to change? And if the behavior changes, what is the behavior that we replace it with? Based on the empirics, it's very difficult to train large language models, and based on the empirics that were discovered so far, these sorts of laws seem to hold. But do we expect that will go on forever, or there are some other behavior that we can find? And just to conclude the intro, it turns out you can go online and just ask a language model to complete the same sentence that I've been trying to complete in the intro, and honestly, it does kind of a good job. I would say, it says that they're powerful. It does a lot of tasks, and basically it captures the idea that it's large. It requires a large amount of training data and resources. Although I would disagree with maybe the last part of the sentence. Okay, so the goal of this talk is to understand this equation. What are the properties that allow this sort of behavior of the test loss to arise, and to write down a statistical model that we can solve that captures it. I guess, sorry, I jumped ahead. So what are the joint properties of data sets and feature maps that lead to this behavior? And we want to find and solve such a model. And then given that we can do that, we can then start to ask or answer some of these other questions that we had that maybe aren't apparent just from studying the empirics of large-scale transformer models. One other point, so in the models that I will study, the different exponents that describe the scaling with the parameters and the scaling with the training set size are going to be equal to each other. That's a property of the models that we'll end up studying. We'll end up studying. In the original OpenAI paper, these had slightly different values. Empirically, there was a follow-up paper by some researchers at DeepMind that argued that if they had trained further, they would find that the exponents were equal. So I think, at least from my perspective, I'm not sure empirically whether they're always equal or not, or whether it depends. It might depend on how long you train for, and it might depend on the different architectures that you use. But for the things that we're going to study, that we're going to set them to be equal. So the goal is to find models that have this behavior and understand their properties. And oh, great, I said this. And then we can use that. Once we have such a model, we can use it to study it in regimes that maybe weren't otherwise studied empirically to answer the sort of questions that we might have. Maybe I can, well, is there any questions before I go on? Okay, so to begin, as I mentioned, so the first place to start is to think about the sort of data properties of data sets. And we've been talking about large language models, which have a very specific type of data, right? It's token, or words converted to tokens, which then become features, which are used in the domain of natural language processing. But then there's also pixels that are features of image data used for computer vision. And so it turns out that actually both domains can exhibit this neural scaling law behavior, have this same test loss behavior that I described on the previous slide. And as I mentioned, Gaussian noise does not, white noise, isotropic white noise does not. So maybe a place to start in our analysis is empirically look at these data sets, maybe some image and NLP data sets, and try to understand the structure in common between these data sets. To do so, let's first, maybe it's helpful to establish the notation that I'm going to use to explain what it is that we're going to explore. So consider a data set of T samples. And so I'm going to represent that as xi. I represents the components. So there's n in input features. So if it's an image, those would be each individual pixel. And then occasionally I'll want to reference which sample in my data set among the T. So the Greek index will represent which sample in the data set. And a very natural quantity to look at is the correlation between input features in the data set, which is characterized by, say, I'll call it the feature covariance matrix. And I'm assuming here that since the means of the input features are not informative, that we just center the means. And so this gives us the covariance between input features, and that's thought to be a pretty informative part of the data, the different correlations between the different input features. And the main quantity of interest that we're going to be looking at is the spectrum of the data set, which is the eigenvalues of this matrix of lambda ij, which I'll denote lambda I. So let's just look at the spectrum of some natural data sets. On the left, this is CFAR10, the spectrum of CFAR10, which is image data set, I believe, of 32 by 32 pixels with 3 color channels. And on the right, I have Wikitext, which is a textual corpus taken from Wikipedia, and then it's then embedded in a vector space. And so looking at the spectrum after the embedding, and this is a function. This index goes from largest to smallest, and here I plotted the size of the eigenvalue. And so we see actually that these spectra have a few things in common that's worth pointing out. So first, the spectrum is well fit by a power law over a certain range. So it's a log plot. This is a line on a log plot. Log plot is a power law. That's what this dotted line is. And so we see that over some range of indices, the spectrum behaves like a power law. And I should add that this was pointed out in a related investigation into understanding neural scaling laws in a paper by Bari, Dyer, Kaplan, Lee, and Sharma. Additionally, for each data set size, the spectrum terminates in a very rapid decline. And we see the same thing over here. And finally, by varying the size of the data set, we can also vary the extent of the power law. So, here we're going over the colors show monotonically increasing data set sizes, and the extent to which this is a valid fit varies according to the size of the data set. And I guess let me just point out the reason that it terminates, maybe not per se an explanation for the exact behavior, which has some sort of universal decay, which can be explained, but the fact that it terminates has a very simple explanation, which is that this covariance matrix, we're summing over a finite number of data points, and so if we have T less than the number of input features, then the covariance matrix is rank limited, and so the number of eigenvalues is going to be limited by the size of the data set. So it's it had to go to 0 at some point, but the interesting part, at least from the part of this discussion, is that the way it fills out as we increase the data set size is by continuing this power law and not some other behavior. I just want to make an aside. So probably many of you are familiar with principal component analysis, in which the covariance matrix is diagonalized to find linear combinations of the input that account for the majority of the variance of the data. And at least the way I was taught it, normally you might think that there's a gap at some eigenvalues such that large eigenvalues are going to account for the majority of the variance, and then the other m+1 to n in eigenvalues are small and unimportant, and so we think of them as being noise, and we think of the top m eigenvalues as sort of being the important parts of the data. And so I just want to contrast this with what we saw in these natural data sets of images and embedded text. They seem to have a continuous spectra, this power law, and so at least maybe for small values of alpha, maybe that suggests that the eigenvalues are all relatively important. There's no, in other words, there's no natural point where we can say, okay, let's stop and throw out the rest of them, right? If you're including the mth one, you might as well include the mth+1, along this power law. And so this, at least contrasts with my intuition for maybe how to think about looking at the spectrum, and so I just wanted to point this out. Okay, so additionally, this power law is bounded by the size of the covariance matrix, which is of course an n by n matrix. And so here I've switched to MNIST because everyone knows that 28 squared is 784, and we see the same sort of features that I described on the last slide with this power law that terminates. And so as we increase the data set size to 784, we see that these curves all bunch up at 784. We can't have more eigenvalues than the size of the number of input features. But I guess in terms of thinking about a model for data generation, thinking about this further, if we imagine that the data was generated from some sort of underlying data generating manifold, where as a hyperparameter we can sort of specify the resolution of the image that we want to generate, we would expect that there'd be more information in more components that we should care about as we increase the number of input features. So this, if we could somehow get larger images that capture the same super resolution images that capture that represent the same thing, we would expect maybe that as we increase the data set size, that it wouldn't bunch up at 784 anymore, it would extend further. And similarly, if we subsampled to get a lower resolution image, we would expect, obviously it would truncate earlier. And similarly,
then sorry to interrupt. There is a question about your plots from the audience. Can you please explain again how feature vectors are constructed for text data in the power law figure?
Sure. It's just taken after embedding. So the way these models, there's a bunch of pre-processing that happens that's kind of not interesting. So you take the text, you have some sort of heuristic way of breaking the text into some sort of tokens, some sort of vocabulary, and then there's a kind of random mapping into a vector space, and you choose its dimension. And so after that point, so we basically do that mapping. That's when we look at the spectrum.
Thank you.
I think also when counting parameters for the scaling laws in the OpenAI paper, they don't count those parameters. They basically assume that treat the input as being the embedded text. Yeah. Okay, great question. So so the point that I wanted to make is that even if we had a fixed input size, if we increased the size of the data set past the size of the input, we normally think that there should be additional information in those samples. The MNIST data set, right, is not 784 samples. It's the test set is like 60,000 samples. And normally what we do in order to access, we create extra features in order to extract that information. In other words, we don't just have if we're doing linear regression, and the standard way of thinking about linear regression is not just linear regression on the raw inputs, but instead we come up with some sort of feature model. Maybe it's a random feature model, maybe we construct feature functions, but we can construct many features that are more than the number of pixels. This is in some sense what a neural network is doing, and that gives us more information when we have more samples. So let's try to understand how that works in the context of looking at the spectra. So what if we try to map to a space n that's larger than nn? Well, if we just do a linear map, as shouldn't be surprising, we don't get any change. The spectrums sort of lie on top of each other, and as we increase the size of this linear mapping, and obviously that's because the new features that we created are linearly dependent on each other. So looking at the spectrum, we're just going to get a bunch of zero eigenvalues, and so even though we map to a larger space, we have a bunch of zero. We just created a bunch of zero eigenvalues. On the other hand, and probably this is obvious to everyone, we could then do something nonlinear, for instance, apply a ReLU to our linear map. And then when we do so, we actually see that the spectrum, that the extent of the power law extends in a way that relates to the size of the ReLU layer. So this is kind of like a random well, you can think of this as a random feature map. And what we're seeing is that when it's nonlinear, we in fact are the way these natural data sets behave. This is true in the other ones. I'm just showing MNIST for simplicity, that we get the power law to extend until we reach the size of the rank of the matrix is still limited by the size of the training set. So here we see this is the input, which is 784, and then we can extend the length of this power law, although it starts to bunch up as we approach the size of the training set. So there's a bottleneck by the size of the amount of data points that we have, but we are able to increase the length of the power law by mapping to by introducing these sorts of nonlinear feature functions. So taken together, so what we conclude is that our stand-in for deep neural network, in this case just a single ReLU layer, can extend the power law, and we're able to find that that if we have more samples than just the number of input features, by constructing these, by making a generalized linear model, we can find useful information, and this is one way of summarizing that point. Okay, so it turns out these are the important properties that I just discussed in terms of how the power law in the spectrum behaves, and what we want is a simple, or what we want to find is a simple model, a generative model of data, and then also a random feature model. So both we want to be able to specify how the data works, and then also specify, build features from that captures the broad empirical properties of these real natural data sets that we talked about, and also the effect of a ReLU layer, which was in our analysis, or in our empirical discussion, our stand-in for more general DNN. So that's what we're going to do now. Now that we have a goal in mind. So let's start with the data. And rather than generating data that's going to live in raw input space, it'll be convenient to generate data in a latent space. That's so I'm going to use capital Roman indices to represent latent space features, and there's going to be m of them. So it's going to be an m-dimensional space, and we're going to take m to be larger than the other scales in the problem. And the way we're going to draw our data is from a zero mean Gaussian distribution, and we're going to specify that the latent features have a power law covariance. Since this is a latent space, we can just choose a basis where the covariance matrix is automatically diagonal, and the diagonal components are is simply the spectrum, and we'll pick some maximum eigenvalue, and then there will be m eigenvalues. So the maximum, we substitute 1 in for j, so that's the maximum one, and then there's also an implied smallest one by substituting m for j there, and we specify an alpha, so we characterize the spectrum by some sort of exponent. So that's how we generate our input points, and then for every latent sample, we're also going to generate a teacher label. And the important point here is, well, let me say what we did. So given a latent data point, we'll also for all latent data points, we'll sample a set of weights, and then the way we construct the label is by contracting those weights with the latent data point. The important point is that all latent features participate in this sum. If they didn't, then from the purpose of the classification problem that we're going to be discussing, or the regression problem we're going to be discussing, then the feature might as well not be present in the input. So we want all the features to contribute to the label. We might also add in some noise to this label. Actually, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to assume that the noise is set to 0, but it does do some interesting things to this analysis. So that's also something that you can do as part of this model. So that's how we generate labels and inputs. And then we can see that this has the right properties that we wanted. So for a finite data set of size t, the spectrum of the latent data is going to be very similar to what we observed for the natural data. So here I've picked the number of latent features to be 1000, and by varying the number of samples and then computing the spectrum, we see that we get power laws that extend to be different lengths. And really these should all taper down like this one does. It's property of the numerics that, and the way I was sampling on the log scale, that you don't see that, but you should, these all kind of have some sort of universal way of decaying to zero. And if we, so we see that this model in the latent space at least represents is similar to what we observed empirically for the natural data, where we can dial in the length of the power law by controlling the size of the data set. So now to find the features, before we had data with a very small input dimension, and we used a single ReLU layer to map it to a larger layer. But here we have a very large dimensional latent sample, and we can just linearly map it to a smaller space n that's smaller than m in order to generate our random feature functions. So given a latent data point xj, we do a linear mapping and we get random features phi I. And we see that this has the important property that we found of the random features, of our natural data after its ReLU layer, was that the extent of the power law on the spectrum depends on the size and the number of features that we have. So we start with latent data that has a large number of latent features, and then after this mapping, we can control the number of features. We can control the length of the power law by changing the number of features. So this linear map, by choosing some random U's, this linear map can control the extent of the power law, giving us n random features. And so taking together, this really has this captures sort of the properties that we discussed of the real data. So if we're bottlenecked by, going back, if we're bottlenecked by the size of the data set, then we can keep changing the number of random features we have to get a power law that extends up to the size of the data set. On the other hand, if we have a fixed number of random features, so this is just reversing what I'm fixing versus what I'm plotting. So here I'm fixing, we have 5,000 latent features. We map to a space of 4,000 random features, and by changing the size of the number of samples in our training set, we can also change the extent of this power law. So by varying either of these resources, the parameters or the data, we can control the extents, and the size of the extent of the power law is basically the minimum between the two, or is controlled by the minimum between n and t. And this is as we observed empirically. So now that we have our latent data, we have our data generating model, and then we also have our random feature model. The goal is to train a linear regression on these random features to reproduce the teacher labels that we generated from the underlying latent features. And so it's sort of a simple model like this. I should also add that a similar problem setup was also discussed in this paper, although they were interested in limits of this solution rather than the full solution. But it's also worth checking out that paper. And now I'm going to suppress indices because I hope everyone's familiar with standard linear regression. I'm just going to give you the full setup before going on to discuss the results. So we have a standard mean squared error loss, and we introduce a ridge parameter. So this is just the linear model with the labels. I guess probably there should be a minus sign there. And we don't actually have to train anything because linear regression has a well-known solution. So we can just not worry about how long we're training for or computational resources. Instead, we just plug in for the actual solution. And so this is the well-known solution. And the goal then is to look at the test loss. So given that solution, we sample another set of data from using our data generating model and evaluate the random features on that test data, evaluate that on the solution to make inferences, and then we want to compute, and then we get a quantity, which is the test loss, where we understand how to generate, we understand the functional form of everything that goes into this expression. And the goal of our analysis is to compute the average of this test loss over everything that we have in the problem. So we want to compute it over the potential label noise. We want to compute it over the randomness in the teacher labels, in the teacher function. We want to compute it over the random features, and we also want to compute it over the data. some of this is pretty easy. So the noise and in the labels, and if you remember the noise, and then also if you remember the labels are a simple linear transformation of the latent space inputs. They're all constant linear or quadratic in this expression, and so it's easy to average over them, and we get an expression that looks like this. But then there's the remaining averages involve inverses and are more complicated. And so actually, I won't have time to discuss the technical details of how we do that average in this talk. I guess I have about 8 minutes left. One thing I can do is point you to this paper. Well, if you're interested, please, I'm happy to chat about it. Hopefully our paper will be out in a month. There's also this paper by Luart, Liao, and Colette that explains how to average an expression like this with fixed labels and fixed training data over random features. And so that's kind of the starting point for our analysis. But then on top of that, you also have to plug in for the fixed labels and then average over the training data itself. So it's not just an average over the random feature model. We also want to average over the training data itself, and that's important because that's where we input these facts that we learned from the natural data about the power law spectrum, and we want to understand how is the power law spectrum that we see in the data itself translated into the test loss. So while I won't explain the details of how we compute the solution, one advantage of a joint model of data and features is that we can just simulate and see what happens. For OpenAI, it costs them lots of money to train transformers and find their scaling laws, to generate those curves that they found on the real textual data from the Common Crawl and also from on these very large models. But in our case, we've just proposed a model that should have the right properties to have the same behavior, so we can just simulate and check. And so, in fact, we find very similar behavior to the cartoon that I showed at the beginning, or I should say the behavior. We see that we have a nice power law, which depends, I haven't shown it here, depends on the exponent alpha in the test loss. And then as we have different numbers of features, we see that we get plateaus when the features are bottlenecking the model. And I should add that in this plot here, we're optimizing over the ridge parameter to find the optimal gamma star. That's analogous to in the OpenAI paper where they used early stopping to regularize their model. In fact, there's an equivalence between those sorts of regularizations. So we see, in fact, using their phenomenological model, we see that the model that we wrote down actually has this correct behavior. It fits quite well. Where here, as I said, there's only one exponent and there's some constant, but you can see basically that our model has a behavior that we were looking for. So given that, let me tell you what we actually did is we were able to compute the average that I told you about 2 slides ago in the limit where the ridge parameter is taken to 0. There's a slight difference in the behavior that we talked about. There's still a power law, and then there's still a plateau, but there's also a non-analytic peak, right, where the model is equiparameterized, right, where the number of test samples, where the number of training sample size of the training set is equal to the number of parameters in the model. And so we get these peaks here, which go away when you regularize. The regularization, the ridge parameter, doesn't seem to matter here or here in the limits. It's only at the specific point. So anyway, this is what we're able to compute analytically, and our solution basically looks like this. Sorry, I don't have time to explain how we got this, but this is the sort of solution that we find, and we actually fit this. We fit the actual behavior quite well. So we, in the end, we are able to find a model that reproduces this behavior. I guess I have 5 minutes left, so let me tell you. So now that we have this model, what can we do with this? Well, one thing we can do is try and understand some of the questions that we set out that we asked at the beginning. And the first is to say something about the breakdown of the scaling laws. In other words, is there a time when this phenomenological model stops being predictive? And if it does, what is the behavior in the new regime? As a hint, there are 3 very important scales in this model that we wrote down. There's the number of random features n, the size of the training set t, and then also the size of the latent space m. And so far, this equation only depends on 2 of the 3 scales in the problem. And so, for instance, let's look at regime where the model has enough capacity to learn all the features from the latent space, where M, the size of the latent space, is less than the number of parameters. That's true for these green and orange curves. For the blue curve, just for comparison, we see that it's in the normal setup where the size of the latent space is larger. And we actually see that this equation breaks down when M is smaller than N. And even it's wrong, it's a little bit wrong also for the curve that would have fit before, because we've made the size of the latent space so small. So somehow this equation needs to incorporate something about the latent space. And furthermore, we see something interesting, which is that basically so this is a situation without noise. And so we see that we get, what does the breakdown look like? There's a power law behavior, and then all of a sudden we get to the point where our model is large enough to learn everything in the latent space, and all of a sudden the test loss goes to zero. Kind of like you keep training these models, and all of a sudden there's a singularity. I guess that's what this is showing. So you can kind of write down a modification to this equation that fits kind of well, although it's kind of wrong here. But the calculation that we do, where there's no that was with the regularization. When there's no regularization, the sort of expressions that we have actually fit this rather well. Here's the peak that we mentioned before, equiparameterization for the model where the latent space is still the largest scale in the problem. And as soon as the latent space is not the largest scale in the problem, we have a different behavior. I should also add, if there's noise and no regularization, this will blow up. If there's noise and regularization, there's some other behavior that we also know how to compute. But I guess the overall thing we learn is that there, for at least to the extent that our model is capturing the true, the true behavior here, there's something that sets the scale of the latent space, and at some point you have captured all of it, and there's a different behavior in this, in the scaling laws. And let's see, I have 2 minutes left. Let me skip a bunch of this. So we gave a model that captures the scaling law phenomenology. I said we solved it, and I wrote down the solution. I didn't explain how. And then let's explore how the bottlenecks, or how the statistical properties of the data and random features are translated into the statistical properties of the test loss. And there's a number of future things that we can talk about. I just want to mention two of them. One is, it seems like an essential question to understand, is where do the power laws in natural data sets come from? And then second, the analysis that I've discussed actually is for linear regression random feature models, not transformers. So maybe it's surprising that this sort of behavior of these scaling laws is present in such a simple model. So there's, I guess, a number of questions about what are we gaining by you, or what do complicated models do? And one way to answer that, I think, could be using sort of these quadratic models that came up in this other work that I had with Xiaohong and Boris Hannon, where we have simple models that do representation learning. So we might be able to go and do the same analysis in those models. It's just a different expression that we have to average that's a bit more complicated, and sort of ask the question of how is having something more non-trivial, how does that learns features, does that change anything to this analysis, or is that irrelevant to sort of the mechanism behind scaling laws? And I think that's my 40 minutes. So let me say thank you for having me here, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, a very exciting talk.
Thanks.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. While people are thinking, maybe one from me. In statistics in general, we tend to think about differentiate between small samples and large samples. So in small sample, we have all these problems with small sample biases, inefficiencies, and in large samples, asymptotics kicks in. Does your understanding and experience with these scaling laws suggest anything about if they can inform us about when actually is the threshold between the small sample and large sample?
Yeah, great, because now I can talk about something that I ran out of time to talk about, which is sort of this point that I made in the beginning. I guess, at least in these models that we studied, and I think this is pretty general phenomenon, right? There's this sort of double descent phenomenon that people like to talk about. This is sort of the classical statistical learning theory regime. This is sort of the overparameterized, sometimes called interpolating regime. And this peak, I guess, kind of separates between those two regions. In this case, it's precisely when the number of features is equal to the size of the training set. But let me use that to make this point, which is that when you regularize, this peak goes away. So it is kind of just smooth. So if you are doing regularization, and there's no, maybe there is no exact point, but you can ask related questions, which is take the scaling, the fact that the scaling laws have this sort of bottleneck, right? If you don't have enough features, or here, if you don't have enough training samples, the test loss plateaus. And so when that starts to happen, maybe that's the point that you're talking about, where you're in this transition point. And from a practical standpoint, like the thing to do is to scale both together, right? You don't want to just keep scaling up the size of your model. At this point, you want to scale the size of your model with the size of the training set. So I use your question to make a broader point, but I guess the answer is that naively, or maybe not naively, but there is this signature of when you're transitioning, and if you're regularizing, you might miss it. But there is this sort of you kind of want to. There's a natural scaling relationship between these two quantities that sort of keep you on the boundary of this region between small sample and large sample, and that for these models that have this sort of power law behavior, power law structure, that seems to be where you actually want to live in order to do the best.
We have a question from
yes,
Mike.
I mean, there's a question from Mike Douglas from the chat. I think you may want to. Okay.
Okay, I guess I can read it. Great talk, Dan. Well, thanks. I'll skip that. I should skip that part. First, do I have any insight into why empirical data has a power law spectrum? No, that was my first question at the end. I'd love to understand that better. We can mumble, as a physicist, I can mumble something about scale invariance or stuff at many scales or something, but I don't know what that means in practice. So I would like to understand that. I mean, sorry, let me be slightly less glib, right? This problem in some sense was constructed so that information at all the different scales contributed to the answer. And I guess where these scaling laws show up in these sort of autoregressive type, predict properties of the input question, it seems like, I guess, to do well, there's always more you can always do better by capturing, to take the image example of sub-resolution type, or lower and lower resolution type data. And then, but yeah, I don't know. I'd love to understand that. And then, are you saying starting from such data and adjoining additional derived features from ReLU on lineal function of the original data, the joint space has another power law spectrum with the same power? So basically, yes, I think there's a subtlety where the exponent changes a small amount, but I'm not sure how general, or in some cases I've seen that, I'm not sure how general that is. In some sense, the exponents, right? The larger the exponent, the faster the decline is. So you can imagine, or here's a story that might be true, but I'm not, I haven't explored enough to really be super confident in it. But I think there's some evidence that take natural data, run it through a network, and look at the features, and so you're mapping to this larger space, and so you get extension of the power law spectrum the way I described. I think it seems, if you don't look carefully, at least for the ReLU experiments that we did, it looks like the power is the same. But if the power decreases, right, then you're going to get slightly worse performance. So you might think that you do get this extension, but there's some penalty of the fact that you're sort of creating these nonlinear features using this artificial random mapping rather than having access to the underlying latent space. And I also think that that's for completely random features. You might ask, what about models that have feature learning? And so that I sort of, the reason for my interest in studying those models like this quadratic model is that it seems plausible that in those models, you might get small corrections to exponents. And it would be interesting to try to understand them either experimentally or try to compute them. T naught is just I had to pick some standard data set size to compare, right? This is a cartoon. So like, the size of the data set. Okay, cool.
We have a question from Miles as well.
Hey Dan, great talk.
Thanks.
I was just curious if you've tried fitting those laws with symbolic regression.
No, but maybe you can tell me more about how to do that.
Okay, I think it'd be cool because it looks like there's other components that aren't captured by the power law. So it'd be cool if there's like a simple structure.
Right. So I mean, there's, this equation captures. Sorry, can we go back? That equation captures this behavior, right? So this has both the power law and sort of this plateau. This is a bit more complicated, and there's some sort of, I guess to answer your question, right? The random matrix computations that we did that gives us what should be the actual functional form when we do all these averages. But maybe you're saying it would be cool to discover it in some other way so that you don't have to do these sorts of averaging. So you don't have to do these sorts of computations.
Components, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, be interesting.
Sorry, can I ask a naive question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay, about the last talk, right? Okay, it's mathematically, statistically interesting, but I wonder, eventually, just talk about this double descent, once we add in penalties disappeared, looks like the things can keep on improving. But in economics, we always talk about no free lunch. So we always have some constraint optimization in the sense you probably should have some cost, right? Computational cost, this or that. I wonder whether or not eventually we should take that into account.
I see. I guess kind of the thing that seems to be true for these models that have this very specific structure, right? So the no free lunch theorem, to the extent that I understand it, applies, when you're averaging over all different types of data examples. There's maybe no structure in the data. I guess the point here is that natural data seems to have this very, for all the examples I've looked at, has this sort of power law structure, and the power law extends and is controlled by the size of the number of parameters and the size of the training set in the way that I said. This is very different. That there's many other choices for data sets, but the data sets that humans seem to care about have the structure. And given that structure, which is pretty rigid, it seems like there's the simple models even behave with this sort of characteristic way, where they want to, where there's basically you need to learn all the details of the latent space, right? There's no point where you've learned enough of the latent space. You always might as well learn another feature, because it sort of has this continuous spectrum. And this changes a little. I didn't talk about noise in this talk. Some of this changes a little bit with, where is it? Some of this changes a little bit when you have noise. So rather than going to zero like this, there is some sort of other behavior here. But the point seems to be that there's sort of just or at least in this model, the way we constructed it, there's a finite number of features in this latent space, and the goal of the model just has to learn all of them in order to perform maximally well. And that seems to be what's behind these sorts of scaling laws that apply for these data sets. I'm not making general statements beyond that. Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
I do not see any other questions. Last chance.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
All right. Let me thank Dan again and all of the speakers. For just to sort of wrap up. Thank you all for tuning in for the nth annual Center of Mathematical Sciences and Applications conference on big data, which is virtual for I think the third year running, but hopefully will be in person on the next occurrence. Let me quickly thank the co-organizers, H.T. Yao and especially Sergiy, I mean, who really, has been like, in all senses, the lead organizer of this series for now a couple of years. So thank you so much for all of your hard work. And then also, of course, the entire CMSA staff team for coordinating and organizing and juggling all of the various logistics and so forth, and just for generally being awesome. So thank you once more to the audience, to the speakers, to the co-organizers, and to the team. And we will hopefully see you in person in 2023 QED.